You are standing on bare grey stone and nothing around you is alive. Not nothing anywhere. The sea behind you is crowded with life, warm and shallow and busy. But here, on the land, at your feet, there is only rock. Wind moves across it. Water runs over it in thin sheets after rain. And that is all. There is no grass to bend in that wind. There is no leaf to catch that water. There is no tree, no shrub, no soft green blade of anything, from the shoreline at your back to the flat, far edge of the world in front of you. This is Earth. It is roughly 440 million years ago, near the boundary between two long periods geologists call the Ordovician and the Silurian. And on the whole of this planet, on every continent, on every hill and plain and riverbank, there is not yet a single plant taller than a couple of inches. The tallest confirmed thing that could rightly be called a land plant, a little green stem named Cooksonia, will not appear in the rock record until about 425 million years ago in what is now Wales. You are early. You have arrived in the long silence before the green. Let yourself settle here for a while. There is nowhere you need to be, and this world is in no hurry. Stay, and let it come to you slowly. Kneel down and put your hand flat against the stone. It is cool. Cool the way a stone countertop is cool under a bare palm in an empty kitchen at night. That same even, mineral chill that pulls the warmth out of your skin without ever seeming to move. The rock is hard and slightly gritty. In places it is smooth, where water has worked it for 10,000 years. There is no give anywhere. No moss cushions your knee. No dead leaf crumbles under your weight. There is no soil at all, in the sense you know soil. No dark, crumbling layer of broken plants and living threads and patient worms. There is only the top of the rock, and then more rock below that. Look at the horizon. This is the strangest part and the hardest to hold in your mind, because you have never once in your life seen a horizon like it. It is flat. It is open. It runs clean and unbroken all the way around you, low and pale and simple, because there is nothing standing up anywhere to interrupt it. No forest edge darkens the distance. No lone tree breaks the line. No hedge, no reed bed, no tangle of brush on the far bank of the river. The light falls on everything at once, hard and even, with no canopy anywhere on the planet to filter it, to break it into shafts, to lay a single shadow of a leaf across the ground. The land is lit the way the surface of the moon is lit, bright, bare, and complete. Listen. This may be the thing your body notices first before your eyes catch up. There is almost no sound. There is the wind, moving over open stone with a low steady hiss, rising and falling as it crosses the ridges. There is water somewhere, a river running grey and cold over a bed of gravel, chuckling in its channel. When the wind drops, you can hear individual small sounds with a clarity that feels wrong, a pebble ticking as it settles, sand hissing along a rock face. But there is no bird song, because there are no birds, and there will be none for hundreds of millions of years. There is no drone of insects over the land. There is no rustle of leaves, because there are no leaves to rustle. There is no creak of wood. The great layered soundtrack of a living landscape, the thing you have heard every day of your life without once listening to it, simply has not been recorded yet. The land is close to silent, and the silence has a weight to it. Smell the air. It is clean in a way that is almost empty. It carries the mineral smell of wet stone, the flat cold scent of a riverbed, a faint salt tang from the sea behind you. It does not carry the smell of growing things, that green humid breath that rises off a meadow at dawn or a forest after rain. There is no rot because there is almost nothing on land to rot. There is no pollen, no cut grass sweetness, no resin. Breathe it in slowly. It is the smell of a planet that is chemically alive and biologically bare, a surface waiting for something it does not yet know is coming. Now, understand what has been shaping this land in the total absence of anything green. Two things only: wind and water. For all the ages before roots, these were the only sculptors the continents ever had. Rain falls on bare rock and runs straight off it, fast, because there is no spongy layer of plant matter to catch it and hold it and let it sink. So the water gathers into sudden sheets and hard channels, and it carries loose grit and sand with it, and it scours. Rivers here do not meander lazily through soft banks the way a modern river does, held in place by the roots of 1,000 plants along its edge. These rivers wander wide and shallow and braided, splitting and rejoining across broad flats of bare sediment, shifting their whole course in a single flood because nothing anchors the ground they run over. Wind does the rest. It lifts dry grit off the exposed rock and drives it, and over enough time it polishes stone, carves it, and moves whole dunes of bare sediment across the land. Erosion, with no green thing anywhere to slow it or stitch the ground together. That absence matters more than it sounds. Plants, when they finally arrive and spread, will change the very chemistry of the planet's surface. Their roots will crack rock and pull it apart. The soft, dark soil they build from their own dead bodies will hold water like a sponge and slow the runoff and steady the rivers into the looping shapes you know. But none of that has happened yet. You are standing in the world before soil, where the ground beneath you is exactly as bare and as mineral as the day the rock cooled and rose. What you are feeling under your palm is not the skin of a living land. It is the bone. Here the honest part of the story begins, and it is a story of uncertainty as much as fact. You might reasonably ask a simple question. Was the land truly, completely empty of all life until Cooksonia? And the honest answer, the one the fossils actually support, is that we are not sure, because there are clues in the rock that something green, or something green adjacent, may have crept onto the land well before any stem tall enough to leave a clear fossil. Those clues are microscopic. In Ordovician rocks, older than Cooksonia by many millions of years, geologists find spores, tiny toughened reproductive cells, some of them clustered in distinctive groups, preserved in sediment that formed on or near the land. Spores like these are the kind of thing that plants make, and so their presence hints, quietly, that some low soft flora may already have been established on land in the Ordovician, generations before the first true stem we can point to and name. But here is the caution, and it is a real one. A spore is not a plant. A spore is a durable little capsule, and durable little capsules can be made by more than one kind of living thing. These earliest microfossils cannot be confirmed as the spores of land plants rather than the spores of algae, or of the low mossy things called bryophytes, or of some plant-like group that has since vanished entirely and left no clearer trace. The rock holds the shape but withholds the name. So the true date of the first green on land, the very first moment a living thing that we would recognize as a plant took hold on bare stone, is genuinely uncertain. It may be as recent as the confirmed record suggests. It may be considerably older, a soft green film we simply cannot prove. It is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than smoothing it over. The deep past is not a finished picture. It is a picture with whole regions left blank, and part of the strange comfort of this world is that even the scientists who know it best will tell you, plainly, where the blanks are. What we can say is this. By the late Silurian, around 425 million years ago, the rock finally gives us something we can hold up and be certain of. A plant. Small, strange, and unmistakable. Its name is Cooksonia. Come close to it, because you will have to. If you were not looking for it, you would walk straight over it and never know. Cooksonia is tiny. The stems stand only a couple of inches high, some barely more than the width of a few of your fingers laid side by side. Picture the green not as a plant in the usual sense, but as a stubble, a thin scattering of upright green threads no taller than the pile of a carpet, catching in low patches on the damp margins of the water. You could rest your open hand over a whole colony of it and hide it completely in your shadow. This is the tallest life on land. This is the crown of the living world, ankle high, and most of it lower than that. Lower yourself down again and really look. Cooksonia has no leaves. None. There is no flat green blade anywhere on it, because the leaf, that clever solar panel you take entirely for granted, has not been invented. There are no flowers, of course, and no fruit and no seeds and no wood and no bark and no roots as you would know them. There is only the stem, a slender green stem, smooth and simple, rising from the wet ground and then dividing. It splits into 2 even branches. Each of those splits again into 2. This even, repeated forking, 2 from one, 2 from each of those, is called dichotomous branching, and it is one of the oldest architectures in the whole history of plants. It builds a tiny green candelabra no higher than your thumb, all fork and no frill. At the tip of each of those little branches sits the point of the whole enterprise, a rounded swelling, a small capsule. This is the sporangium, the spore case, and it is the reproductive heart of the plant. Inside it, Cooksonia makes and holds its spores, those durable cells, and when they are ready, the capsule releases them to the wind and the water to be carried off and, with luck, to grow. That is the entire life plan. No pollinator is needed because there are no animals here to do the work and no flower to tempt them. No fruit is offered because there is nothing to eat it. The plant simply lifts its spore cases a couple of inches off the ground, just high enough to give the wind a slightly better grip, and lets go. Everything about it is pared down to the barest possible way of being a plant on land. There is one more detail, and it is the detail that makes Cooksonia matter far beyond its size. In at least one kind of Cooksonia, when you slice the stem and look at its heart under strong magnification, you find a dark central stripe running up through the middle of it. A thin, darkened core. Paleobotanists read that stripe as early vascular tissue, the first plumbing. A bundle of specialized cells built to carry water up from the wet ground into the stem and to give the stem a little stiffness so it can stand against gravity and the wind instead of lying flat. This is why Cooksonia earns its title as the earliest confirmed vascular land plant. That thin, dark line is the ancestor of every vein in every leaf you have ever held, of every ring in every trunk, of the entire internal architecture that will one day let a plant stand hundreds of feet tall. Here it is a stripe you would need a microscope to see, in a stem shorter than your little finger. The whole towering future of forests is folded into that one small dark thread. Sit with the scale of that for a moment, because it is easy to say and hard to truly feel. Everything green that will ever grow tall begins at ankle height, in the damp at the edge of the water, in a plant you could cover with one hand. The pipework that will someday raise water 300 feet into the crown of a giant tree is, right now, a faint stripe in a stem 2 inches long. Nothing about this little green stubble looks like a beginning. It looks like an afterthought. A few threads of colour scattered on an enormous plain of stone, and yet it is holding at its core the single invention that changes the possible height of life on land forever. Walk on a little, slowly, and let your eyes lower to the ground the way they have to here. The living world in this age asks you to look down, not up. All the drama is at your feet, in the wet margins, in the thin green film in the low damp places where these early plants can cling. Up above there is only sky and the flat hard light. There is no middle distance of branches, no high green ceiling, none of the layered vertical world you move through without thinking. The land has length, and it has width. Miles and miles of both. But it has almost no height at all. It is a world measured in inches upward and in horizons outward, and standing in it changes the shape of your attention. You become a creature that watches the ground. Feel too how exposed everything is. With nothing standing up to break the wind, the air moves unimpeded across the whole surface, and it is cold when it moves and warm when it stops, with none of the soft buffering a forest gives. With no canopy to hold moisture, the damp places dry fast in the open light, and flood fast in the rain, So life clusters tight to the water, to the river edges and the shallow pools and the seeping ground, wherever the wet will linger long enough for a spore to take. The green is not spread evenly across the land. It hugs the water like a faint stain, and everywhere back from the water the stone runs bare again. Now take a slow breath of that thin, clean, empty air, and let the true size of the moment settle over you, because you are standing at a hinge. For billions of years, all through the vast early history of this planet, life stayed in the water. The seas filled with it, layered and complex and ancient, while the land above the tide line stayed bare rock under bare sky, lifeless in the way you would recognize, age after age after age. And now, right here, at your feet, in these few inches of forked green stem in the Silurian damp that is beginning to change, life has come ashore, not with a roar, not in a single dramatic leap, but as a low green stubble creeping out of the shallows onto the wet edge of the stone, holding on, letting go its spores, holding on again. It will not stay small. That is the quiet promise hidden in the dark stripe at Cooksonia's core. Once a plant can carry water up a stem and stand against gravity, the only real limit left is time, and time is the one thing this planet has in overwhelming supply. Give that little pipework enough generations and it will thicken into wood. Give those anchoring threads enough generations and they will drive down into the rock and become roots that split stone and build soil. Give this ankle-high stubble long enough and it is going to climb, first to knee height, then to the height of a person, then higher than you could reach, and higher than that, until the flat open horizon you're standing under now is finally broken, somewhere far ahead in time, by the first green thing taller than the ground. But not yet. Hold on to this not yet, because it is the whole gift of this place. You are here before all of it, before the roots, before the wood, before the shade. You are standing in the last age when a person could see clear to the edge of the world across bare stone, when the tallest living thing on the whole of the land would not reach the top of your shoe, when the wind crossed the continents and met nothing at all to slow it down. There will be time for the great forests. There will be ages of them, coming on slowly, one invention at a time. Right now there is only this. Grey rock, cool as a countertop under your hand. Thin green stubble in the damp. Wind, water, and a silence with no leaf in it anywhere. Stay in that silence a moment longer. The light is even and pale. The river runs cold and braided across its wide bare flats, going nowhere in particular, held in by nothing. At the edge of the water, the little forked stems of Cooksonia lift their spore cases the smallest distance into the moving air, patient, undramatic, doing the one thing they know how to do. And in the dark heart of each of those stems, thinner than a thread, runs the first faint line of the plumbing that will one day raise water into a canopy you cannot yet imagine. The land does not know what it is holding. The wind does not know. There is no one here to know. Only you stand quietly at the very start of it, watching the ground. And so the green crept upward, cell by patient cell, toward the first thing on earth that could rightly be called a forest. And so the green crept upward, cell by patient cell, toward the first thing on earth that could rightly be called a forest. It did not hurry. Nothing in this world hurried. For long stretches of time before this, the tallest living things on land had stood only inches high, a few green fingers of leafless stem, branching in simple forks, rising from bare rock and wet grey mud. The oldest of them we can name with confidence is Cooksonia, from rocks in Wales laid down about 425 million years ago. Picture a plant no taller than a blade of grass, each stem split in two, then split again, and ended in a small rounded capsule that held its spores. Down the centre of some of those stems runs a dark thread, a stripe of tissue that carried water, the earliest plumbing on land. That thread mattered more than its size suggests. It meant a plant could lift water against gravity, and so a plant could dare to grow tall. Stay with me here, and let your breathing slow to the pace of this world. There is no rush in what follows. We have millions of years to cross, and we will cross them softly, one patient scene at a time. Now move forward, only a little, to a low wetland in what is now northeast Scotland. The ground near the village of Rheiny in Aberdeenshire hides one of the most extraordinary windows in all of paleontology. The rock there formed in the early Devonian somewhere between roughly 407 and 412 million years ago, and it did not form gently. This was a place of hot springs. Volcanic heat drove water up through the ground, and that water was heavy with dissolved silica. Imagine standing at the edge of it. The air carries a mineral tang, faintly sulphurous, the smell of geothermal water breathing out of the earth. You hear the soft hiss and bubble of the springs. Where the hot water spreads and cools, it lays down a pale crust called sinter, the same silica hardening into stone. That hardening is the miracle. When the spring water flooded the low ground, it soaked into the living plants and small animals among them. Silica filled their tissues before they could rot. It set around each cell like glass poured into a mould. The wetland was buried in place, upright, exactly where it grew. And so, across all that distance of time, the Rhynie chert preserves an entire ecosystem cell by cell, not a flattened smear, not a faint outline in shale. Actual cells, with their walls intact, the strands of water-carrying tissue still visible under a lens. You are looking at soft green life turned to stone so finely that its inner architecture survives. 7 named plant species have been found in that ancient wetland. None of them stood taller than about 16 inches. That's the whole forest, if you can call it that. A knee-high tangle at most, of slender green stems in standing water and damp soil. Walk slowly through it in your mind. The plants are simple and strange to a modern eye. Some, like the one called a glyphyton, are little more than smooth, forking stems that crept and rose, without true roots and without true leaves. Others, given the name Rhynia, are the tidy image of an early vascular plant, upright stems tipped with spore capsules, anchored by fine hair-like threads instead of a root system. There are no flowers here. There is no bark, no branch you could snap, no shade. Just green stems standing in bright open light, because nothing on the whole planet was tall enough to cast a real shadow. The quiet of that place is almost complete. No bird song, because birds lie more than 200 million years in the future. No rustle of leaves, because leaves as we know them have barely begun. Only the hiss of the springs, the trickle of water, and the faint stir of the smallest animals moving through the stems. And there were animals. The Rhynie chert holds the most diverse community of early land arthropods known from anywhere in rock of its age. Tiny mites, small spider relatives, springtails, and other jointed creatures no bigger than a grain of rice, living among the stems, some of them already feeding on the plants and on each other. An entire miniature world sealed in silica, small enough to hold in your cupped hands, patient enough to wait 400 million years for a lens to find it. Rest in that image for a moment. A warm, low wetland under an open sky. Mineral steam drifting off pale, crusted ground. Green stems no higher than your shin. This is the land just beginning to learn how to be a forest. And it has almost none of the parts yet. Because to build a forest, life needed inventions it didn't have in that Rhynie pool. It needed roots that could reach deep and hold. It needed wood, real wood, strong enough to lift a crown of foliage high into the air and keep it there through storms, and it needed a way to grow tall without drowning its own base in shadow. Those inventions were coming. When they arrived, they would change everything about how the land looked from above. Follow the green forward again, tens of millions of years, into the middle and late Devonian. The low stubble is rising now. Some plants have found the trick of thickening their stems, of laying down tissue year by year. A few have begun to climb toward heights that would put a shadow on the ground for the first time. The tree that best carries this moment has a name that sounds like a bird but was pure plant. Archaeopteris. Not to be confused with the feathered Archaeopteryx of much later rocks. This was one of the first organisms that truly deserves the word tree. What makes Archaeopteris so striking is that it was a creature of two worlds stitched together. Up in its crown it wore fronds of fern-like foliage, soft and feathery and green, the look of a plant that reproduced with spores. But down below, its trunk was something new. It grew real wood, dense and structural, the kind of trunk you would find in a modern conifer or its relatives. A woody column, growing thicker each season, holding that feathery crown up into the light. Reach out and imagine your hands on a young one. On a slender trunk you could very nearly close both hands around it, fingertips almost touching, feeling the firm woody core beneath a thin skin of tissue. That firmness is the quiet revolution. Wood is what lets a plant stop hugging the wet ground and stand up into the open air, tall enough to overshadow everything shorter, tall enough to reach light that its neighbours cannot. And beneath that trunk lay the other half of the invention. Roots. Not the fine anchoring threads of the reedy plants, but deep, branching, exploring root systems, as sophisticated in their structure as those of modern seed plants. We know their reach because we have found where they grew. Near the town of Cairo, in the Catskill region of New York, lies one of the oldest fossil forests on Earth, its floor laid down about 386 million years ago. The rock there preserves the ground plan of a living forest, not the trees themselves standing, but the prints of their root systems, radiating outward through the ancient soil like the spokes of great buried wheels. The largest belong to Archaeopteris, and they run more than 36 feet from the base of a single tree. Let that length settle. Picture the width of a comfortable room, wall to wall and then more. A single Archaeopteris could spread its roots wider than a living room floor, threading through the soil, gripping it, drinking from it, breaking it apart. Roots that long do more than hold a tree upright. They reach down and outward and split the rock and soil into finer and finer pieces, pulling water and minerals into the living world and leaving broken ground behind. The Cairo site covers at least 3/4 of an acre of that ancient forest floor, and it holds more than one kind of tree. Scientists have mapped 3 distinct root systems there, 3 different ways of gripping the earth. That single detail tells us something quietly profound. This was not a monotony of one plant repeated. It was already a mixed forest, with different trees rooted in different places, tall ones and lower ones sharing the ground, each suited to its own patch of wet or dry soil. Forest structure, the layering and sorting we still walk through today, was already being written into the land. Not far away lies the older, famous fossil forest at Gilboa, in the same corner of New York, long celebrated as one of the earliest forests ever found. Between them, these sites let us stand on the floor of the Devonian and look up, in the mind's eye, at the first true canopy in the history of the planet. Think about what that canopy meant for the ground below. For the entire span before this, the land had been brightly, harshly, evenly lit. Every low green stem stood in full sun. Now, for the first time, a tree threw real shade. Beneath an Archaeopteris crown the light fell dappled and cool, and a new kind of place existed on Earth. A shaded forest floor. Somewhere a plant or a small animal could live out of the direct glare of the sun, in the moist quiet under the leaves. Before we walk deeper into the wood, let this be the one small pause I ask of you. If these long, slow journeys through deep time help carry you towards sleep, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the thought go, and come back down onto the soft Devonian floor with me. There is nothing more you need to do tonight but breathe and listen, because the roots doing their patient work underground were reshaping the planet in ways no single tree could feel. As Archaeopteris and its kin spread across the Devonian world, their deep roots weathered rock on a scale the land had never known. They pulled carbon dioxide out of the air, locked into new soils and into their own growing bodies. They fed rivers with broken minerals and altered the chemistry of the water that ran down to the sea. A forest is not only a place, it is a slow engine, breathing on the atmosphere, grinding on the stone, and Archaeopteris was among the first engines large enough to matter. Yet for all its wood and all its reach, Archaeopteris still carried one deep vulnerability from the ancient world of the Rhynie pool. It reproduced with spores, and a spore is a small, unguarded gamble. It needs the right damp ground to land on, and, at the crucial moment, it needs a film of water so that the swimming sperm cell of the plant can reach the egg. The whole flowering, or rather the whole spore-bearing act of reproduction, was still chained to standing water. The forest could grow tall, but it could not fully leave the wet behind. The breaking of that chain is the last great invention of this green age, and it too appears in the Devonian. Somewhere around 400 million years ago, in the late Devonian, there lived a modest plant with a name that hides its importance, Elkinsia polymorpha. To the eye it would have looked like another frond-bearing plant among many, low and green and unremarkable. It is often placed among a group we call the seed ferns, plants with fern-like foliage that had begun to do something ferns never could. Elkinsia is the earliest known seed plant on Earth. Here is the quiet genius of what it did. Instead of casting loose spores to the wind and the wet, hoping they would land somewhere kind, Elkinsia held its eggs, its ovules, on the parent plant, wrapped inside small protective structures called cupules. Picture delicate curved fingers of tissue, cradling the ovule, sheltering it. This is not yet the hard, familiar seed of a pine cone or an acorn. It is the forerunner of the seed, the first draft of that idea, the first time a plant packaged the next generation inside a protective case rather than releasing it naked into the world. And with that package, reproduction on land was for the first time going to break free of standing water. An ovule sheltered on the parent, fertilized in place and then set out into the world with a protective coat, does not need a pond or a film of rain to make the crucial connection. The plant carries its own moisture, its own shelter, its own small provision. It could reproduce on drier ground, higher ground, ground that spores could never have colonized. Hold the two inventions side by side in your mind, because together they are the whole future. Wood let plants stand tall and cast the first shade. The seed, in its earliest cupule form, let plants leave the water's edge and march up the slopes and into the dry interior of the continents. A tree with wood and a plant with seeds, if you could combine them, could build a forest almost anywhere. Nature was already testing that combination. Archaeopteris gave the world a woody trunk and a modern root. Elkinsia gave the world the sheltered ovule. Neither was the final answer, and neither knew what it had begun. But the two together sketch the shape of every forest that has ever followed, right up to the trees outside your window tonight. Let yourself drift back down, one more time, onto that ancient ground. Feel how much has already changed since the knee-high wetland at Rhynie. There are trunks now, real ones, rising overhead. There are crowns of frond catching the light and letting it fall broken onto a shaded floor. There are roots the width of a whole room, splitting the soil in the dark. And here and there, low among the taller plants, a modest seed fern cradles its ovules in tiny cupped hands, holding tomorrow safe from the drying air. There is still no flower anywhere, no petal, no scent, no bright colour but green and brown and the grey of wet stone. No fruit hangs from any branch, no grass softens any slope. The palette of the living land is narrow and ancient, and it will stay narrow for a very long time yet. But the emptiness of the earliest land is gone for good. Once a forest exists, it does not easily surrender the ground. Each tree that falls feeds the soil that grows the next. Each root that splits the rock makes richer earth behind it. The Devonian world had crossed a threshold that would never be uncrossed. The land had learned to grow tall, to cast shade, and to carry its own water in a seed. Take one slow, settling breath and let the scene widen. Pull back above the fern-crowned canopy, above the hot springs and the shaded floor, until the first forests are only a dark green stain spreading across the pale continents. Watch that stain thicken and darken, year by patient year, creeping up the river valleys and out onto the higher ground, following the new seeds into country that green life had never touched before. Come north with me now to a corner of upstate New York where the ground still holds the shape of a forest, almost unimaginably old. Near the small town of Cairo at the eastern edge of the Catskills, there is a worn quarry floor. From standing height it looks like nothing. Plain grey rock, flat and scarred, open to the sky. But lower yourself toward it, and the stone begins to organise into something. Lines, curves, a pattern too deliberate to be accident. What you are looking at is roughly 386 million years old. That is Devonian time, long before the first dinosaur, long before the first seed-bearing forest most people ever picture. And spread across that quarry floor, mapped out patiently over at least 32,000 square feet, is the trace of a real forest, not a single lucky trunk, a whole living community printed into the rock as the casts and stains of its roots. 3 distinct root systems have been read here, and that number matters more than it first sounds. 3 root systems means 3 different kinds of tree, 3 ways of gripping the ground, 3 strategies for drinking from the same wet Devonian soil. This was not a monoculture. It was already varied, already sorted, different plants holding different footholds in the same patch of world. The forest was heterogeneous almost from the moment forests existed at all. One of those root systems belongs to a tree called Archaeopteris. Hold that name for a moment, because it is one of the quiet giants of this whole long green age. Archaeopteris carried a crown of fern-like foliage above a genuinely woody trunk. Below the ground, it sank a root network as complex as anything a modern tree grows today. At Cairo, those roots have been traced radiating outward for more than 36 feet from where the trunk once stood. Try to feel that length against your own body. Stand up in your mind and stretch both arms wide as far as they will go. That span, fingertip to fingertip, is roughly your own height, 5 or 6 feet for most people. Now imagine a single root reaching 6 times farther than that, snaking out across the stone floor past where you could ever touch. 1 tree, 1 root, longer than a row of people lying head to foot. That is the reach preserved in this rock. A grip on the earth that wide, from a tree that lived before there were true seeds. And that reach is the whole point of the detective story here, because roots are not just how a tree stands up. Roots are how a tree breaks stone into soil, how it pulls carbon down out of the air, how it changes the chemistry of the entire planet's surface. A forest whose trees could throw roots 36 feet in every direction was a forest actively remaking the ground beneath it. It was drawing down carbon dioxide, weathering rock, building the first deep soils. The Devonian world was being quietly re-engineered by things with no eyes and no hurry, and the evidence is written right here in these radiating grey lines. Stay with the people who read them. There is a particular kind of patience in this work, and it is worth sitting inside. No one at Cairo dug up a towering fossil trunk and hauled it to a museum. What survives is mostly absence, the shape a root left behind after it rotted and after minerals filled the hollow it had made. To find a forest that way, you walk a bare quarry floor on your hands and knees. You brush and sweep and wet the rock to raise the contrast. You mark each faint line, follow it until it forks, and note where one root system stops and another begins. You map thousands of square feet of stone this way, one traced curve at a time, until a forest floor emerges out of what looked like blank ground. Nothing dramatic enters that ancient scene as you reconstruct it. There are no animal tracks crossing the root casts, no bones, no fallen nests. The Devonian forest at Cairo, as best anyone can tell, was a place of roots and water and slow green growth, standing in a quiet the modern world can barely imagine. When you picture it, keep it that way. No machines, no voices, no built thing anywhere on the horizon. Only the trees, the mud, the wide flat light, and the roots working downward in silence. The patience belongs entirely to the scientist brushing the rock, the The scene they uncover holds a stillness all its own. Now, why does a worn quarry floor near one small town matter enough to reset a timeline? For that, you have to look a short distance away to the older and far more famous site at Gilboa, also in upstate New York. Gilboa has been celebrated for generations as one of the oldest known forests on Earth. Its stumps were found long ago, and for a long time they shaped how people imagined the first trees. The picture that settled in was of something primitive, something not quite modern, an early experiment in standing tall. Cairo complicated that picture in the best way. It sits close to Gilboa in space, and it is, if anything, slightly older in time, and yet what it preserves is more advanced, not less. Those Archaeopteris roots, spreading 36 feet across the quarry floor, are essentially modern in their architecture. They branch and taper and forage through the soil the way the roots of a living seed plant do. So here was a forest older than the textbook example, and it was already growing trees with thoroughly modern underground engineering. That is the reset. It means the sophisticated tree, the one with a woody trunk above and a deep, complex, far-ranging root system below, arrived earlier than long believed. The modern forest did not slowly assemble itself piece by piece over vast stretches of the Devonian while simpler plants held the stage. At Cairo, near the very beginning of the forest record, the essential design is already in place. The revolution had, in a sense, already happened. This is the part of the work that never makes noise but changes how you see everything downstream. A single, well-mapped quarry floor, published in 2019 out of careful study led by researchers connected to Binghamton University and their colleagues, quietly pushed the origin of modern-style forest architecture deeper into the past. Not with a spectacular skeleton, with root casts, with grey lines on grey rock, traced by hand until the pattern could not be denied. Let the scale of that settle as you drift. The whole future of green life on land runs through trees like these. Everything that comes after, the coal swamps, the conifer stands, the cycad groves. The great dinosaurs would one day browse. All of it depends on the innovations first tested by Devonian pioneers like Archaeopteris. Roots that could anchor a heavy trunk, wood that could hold a crown up into the light, a living thing that could stand for years in one place and reshape the soil around it. Cairo shows you those innovations already working, already varied across three kinds of tree, roughly 386 million years ago. There is something restful in how ordinary the setting is. No cliff face, no dramatic badland, just a quiet quarry in New York State, the kind of place you could walk past without a second glance. And under your feet, if you knew where to kneel and how to look, the oldest forest floor holding roots that reached farther across the stone than you could stretch on your best day. The evidence was there the whole time, waiting for someone patient enough to read it line by line. Picture the ancient version once more before we move on. The trunks rise from wet, dark ground. Archaeopteris spreads its fern-like foliage overhead, and near it two other kinds of tree hold their own patches of soil, their own root territories laced through the same earth. Water stands in shallow sheets between them. There are no flowers, of course. There is no grass, no bird, no bark-boring beetle, just green and brown and the grey of the ground, and the enormous slow labour of roots pulling the sky's carbon down into the mud. Those roots are doing the deep work of the age. Every foot they push outward pries a little more mineral out of the rock and builds a little more true soil. Every season they thicken and reach and hold. Across the whole planet, forest by forest, that patient underground reaching was changing the air, cooling the climate, and laying the ground for the towering worlds to come. What Cairo lets you touch is the earliest clear proof that the machinery was already running, already modern, already at scale, so carry that image forward with you. A wet Devonian forest floor, silent and green, its roots stretching farther than open arms could span, standing near the beginning of trees and yet already fully committed to the design that would carry life upward for the next 300 million years. The pioneers had done their part. The blueprint was set, the soils were deepening, and the rains kept coming down on ground that could finally hold them. The forest thickened across the drying land, and the world tilted toward its greatest green excess yet. The forest thickened across the drying land, and the world tilted toward its greatest green excess yet. Stand for a moment at the edge of the water. The ground under your feet is not ground in any firm sense. It is black mud, warm and soft, sucking gently at your weight, laced with the roots of things that have been growing and dying here for a very long time. The air lies heavy on your skin. It is thick and warm, like breath held in cupped palms, and it does not move. Somewhere ahead of you the trees begin, and they climb so high that you cannot see where they end. This is the Carboniferous, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, and you are standing inside the coal that has not formed yet. Let that settle before you go any further. The blackness beneath your feet, the peat, the rotting mat of fallen stems, all of it is the raw beginning of the coal seams that will one day be mined 250 million years from now. You are not looking at a forest that leaves no trace. You're standing on the future itself, slowly compressing. Every trunk that topples here and sinks into the airless mud is a deposit that will not be spent for an unimaginable span of time. The swamp is a bank, and it is filling. Now look up at the trees, because they are unlike anything alive today. The tallest of them is Lepidodendron, the scale tree, and it does not grow the way a modern tree grows. Its trunk rises straight and green, and almost unbranched for most of its height, a smooth column that only splits into a crown near the very top. The largest of them reach something close to 164 feet, the 50-metre mark that paleobotanists cite as an upper limit rather than an everyday size. Their trunks spread more than 6.5 feet across at the base. Picture a dinner table stood on end, and you have the width of one. Here is the strange part, the part worth holding in your mind as you look. That towering column is not made of wood, not true wood, not in the sense you know. A modern oak or pine holds itself up with dense woody tissue laid down ring by ring. Lepidodendron did something else entirely. It held its great height on a thick outer rind of soft tissue, a turgid cortex kept rigid by water pressure, the way a garden hose stiffens when the tap is opened. The centre was often hollow or filled with soft pith. These giants were, in a sense, pressurized. They were not trees as you understand trees, though the name has stuck to them for centuries. Reach out and touch the bark gently in your imagination. It is covered in a pattern you would recognize anywhere once you had seen it. Rows of diamonds run up the trunk in tidy spirals, each diamond a scar left where a long strap-shaped leaf once attached and later dropped away. That is why they are called scale trees. The bark looks scaled, reptilian, like the flank of something that should be breathing. Those diamond leaf scars are so distinctive that geologists still use them today. Find that pattern pressed into a slab of rock, and you can date the rock. The scale tree became a clock, an index fossil, a signature of Carboniferous time written across the world. Before you walk further into the shade, one small thing quietly asked. If you find these long, slow journeys through deep time useful for drifting off, you can keep them coming back to you, that is all. Now let the swamp close around you again. The scale trees did not grow slowly. This is one of the odd truths of their world. A lepidodendron could shoot upward at a startling rate, racing for the light on its column of pressurized tissue, and then, having flowered and shed its spores near the top, it could simply die, its whole life bent toward that single reproductive moment high in the canopy. Many of them lived fast, reached for the sun, released their spores in vast clouds, and toppled. The forest was not a place of ancient, patient giants standing for 1,000 years. It was a place of rapid rising and frequent falling, a green machine running hot. And underneath those towering columns grew a second forest, lower down in the humid shade. These were the tree ferns, and the one to know by name is Sironius. It stood far shorter than the scale trees, somewhere in the range of 33 to 49 feet tall, a slender trunk crowned with a rosette of enormous fronds. Those fronds could stretch 6 to 10 feet each, spreading outward like the ribs of a green umbrella. Beneath them the light went soft and dim and endlessly filtered. Where a scale tree reached for the roof of the world, Sironius made a ceiling of its own, closer to the swamp floor over the standing water. Look closely at the trunk of that tree fern, because it is doing something a modern trunk never does. Sironius did not thicken by laying down wood. Instead, it wrapped itself over its whole life in a dense mantle of small roots growing down from above, sheathing the slim inner stem in a thick jacket of root tissue. That mantle was not dead cladding. It was alive, and it was inhabited. Other plants took root in it. Vines threaded through it and climbed. Small ferns and epiphytes settled into its crevices and grew there, high off the ground, drinking the constant damp. A single Sironius was, in the words of the paleobotanists who study it, an ecosystem unto itself. You would rarely find the whole tree fern preserved. What you find instead, again and again, are its leaves, pressed flat into the rock as a delicate lacework of fronds. Those fossil leaves have their own name, Archaeopteris, given to the foliage before anyone knew for certain which plant had worn it. Split open a lump of Carboniferous shale and you may see them, the fine parallel veins, the neat rows of leaflets, a frond that fell into black mud 300 million years ago and was caught. It is one of the most common plant fossils of the whole period. The ferns rained their leaves down endlessly, and the swamp kept everyone it could. So raise your eyes and take in the whole architecture at once, because it is a shape the world had never held before. 2 canopies, one stacked above the other. High overhead, the scale trees, 100 feet and more, their crowns splitting into forked branches tipped with cones. Below them, the tree ferns, spreading their broad fronds at 40 feet, catching whatever light leaks through from above. And below that, on the wet floor, a tangle of smaller plants, horsetails as tall as a house, seed ferns, ground cover thick and dripping. The forest was layered like a drowned cathedral, and every layer was some shade of green or brown. There was no other colour to be had. Feel the conditions down here on the floor with you. It is hot, and it is wet, and the wet never lifts. The air holds so much water that everything drips even when no rain falls. Standing pools lie black and still between the root buttresses, skinned with a film of decay. The smell is the smell of a marsh turned up to its fullest. The mineral tang of stagnant water, the sweetish rot of leaves half broken down, the sourness of mud that never sees oxygen. Underfoot the dead plant matter piles and piles and does not vanish. It rots slowly, grudgingly, if at all. It simply accumulates, layer on sodden layer, sinking under its own weight. That slow rot is the secret of the whole age, and it is worth understanding gently, because it explains everything you are standing on. In a modern forest, a fallen trunk is swiftly attacked. Fungi and microbes move in and break it down, dismantling even the toughest fibres, releasing the stored carbon back into the air as the wood decays. But in the Carboniferous, that machinery was not yet fully in place. The plants had learned to build with lignin, the tough reinforcing compound that stiffens wood and bark. The decomposers had not yet fully learned to take it apart. Lignin resisted decay, so the fallen tissue did not surrender its carbon. Follow that one fact into its consequence, because the consequence is vast. Trunk after trunk, frond after frond, fell into the airless mud and was buried before it could break down. The carbon locked inside those plants, drawn out of the air as the trees grew, went into the ground and stayed there. It did not cycle back. Across millions of years and countless swamps like this one, an almost incomprehensible quantity of carbon was buried intact, squeezed under later rock, heated, compressed across deep time. It became peat, then lignite, then the black coal seams that would name the entire period. You are watching the planet inhale and hold its breath. That burial did more than make coal. It changed the air you are breathing right now, in this scene, on this bank. As all that carbon went into the ground, the balance of the atmosphere shifted. The plants pulled carbon dioxide down and pumped oxygen out, and with so much of the carbon side locked away in the mud, the oxygen kept climbing. By the height of the Carboniferous, the air may have reached as much as 35% oxygen, against the roughly 21% you know from the modern world. Every breath here carries a third more oxygen than any breath you have ever actually taken. The swamp is not just wet and warm, it is charged. You would feel that richer air in ways you might not expect. Fire, for one, behaved differently. In an atmosphere this oxygen-heavy, flame catches more readily and burns hotter and faster than any modern fire. A lightning strike in these forests could run wild. Charcoal turns up in Carboniferous rocks in quantities that tell of frequent burning, of a green world periodically swept by fast, fierce fire, even as the swamp stayed sodden. It is a strange pairing to hold in your mind. A landscape drowning in water and stacked with rotting vegetation, and yet primed, whenever it dried enough, to burn like a struck match. And the oxygen did something else, something you can almost hear. It loosened one of the deepest limits on animal life. Before you go looking for the makers of that sound, take one slow breath of this over-rich air and let the forest speak for itself. Because if you stand very still on the black bank now and simply listen, what you notice first is what is missing. There is no birdsong. None. Not a single call of the kind that fills any modern forest at dawn. Birds do not exist and will not for well over 100 million years. Neither do frogs as you know them, nor any mammal, or any voice that a person would recognize. The great-scale trees rise into silence. What sound there is comes from wind moving the high fronds, from water dripping and trickling, from the occasional heavy splash of something shifting in the shallows, and through it, now and then, a dry papery whir that belongs to no animal alive today. That whir comes from the wings of Meganeura, and it is the first of the giants the rich air allowed. Meganeura was a relative of the dragonfly, and it flew on wings that spanned somewhere between 26 and 30 inches from tip to tip. Hold your arms apart the width of a hawk, and you have it. It hunted through the gaps in the canopy on those enormous stiff wings, a predator of the open air, its body a long dark rod beneath them. Insects breathe by drawing air directly into their tissues through tiny tubes, and that method sets a hard ceiling on how large an insect can grow. The over-rich Carboniferous air lifted that ceiling, and the insects rose to meet it. Now let your gaze drop to the forest floor, to the leaf litter and the mud, because the largest of them did not fly at all. Somewhere in the wet debris moves Archaeopteris, and Archaeopteris is the largest land invertebrate that has ever lived. It was a millipede, or a very close cousin of one, and it grew to more than 8 feet in length. The Natural History Museum in London has described it fairly as car-sized. Picture that. A segmented armoured body as long as a small car, low and broad, rippling forward on rank after rank of legs through the rotting ferns, feeding on the endless fallen plant matter. It made no cry. You would hear only the scrape and rustle of its passage. We will linger with these giants and their strange over-oxygenated world more fully a little later. For now, let them simply be there, at the edges of your attention. The griffinfly turning somewhere in the high green light, the great millipede grinding slowly through the litter, both of them made possible by the same buried carbon and the same enriched air that is laying down the coal beneath your feet. They are the animal face of the same story the trees are telling. When the world grows this green and this rich, life grows large to fill it. Come back now to the trees themselves, and to the sheer scale of what is happening across the whole planet, not just this one swamp. Forests like this one stretched across enormous lowland basins on the tropical continents, coast to coast, swamp merging into swamp. It was, in a real sense, the greatest sustained pulse of plant growth the land had ever seen. The green machine ran across whole continents at once, drinking carbon from the sky, stacking it in the mud, breathing oxygen into an atmosphere that grew steadily richer until it fed millipedes the length of a car. Nothing in the long ages before had matched it, and in some ways nothing since quite has. Stand a while longer in the doubled shade and let yourself feel how patient it all was. There was no hurry here. The scale trees rose and fell, the tree ferns shed their Archaeopteris fronds season on season, the water sat black and still, and the peat thickened by a fraction of an inch across a human lifetime, and by fathoms across the deep patience of a geological instant. A single cold seam a few feet thick can represent thousands of years of forest. Compressed to a black band you could span with your open hand. Every layer of it is a forest that once stood exactly where you are standing, drowned and buried and kept. Think, too, about how deeply the shade lay over everything. Beneath the two canopies, sunlight arrived only in scattered coins, shifting slowly across the mud as the high fronds moved. A creature living on that floor spent its whole life in a green twilight, in warm, wet air heavy enough to feel against the skin, in a silence broken only by water and wings. There were no flowers to break the green, no fruit, no scent of blossom, no colour that a modern eye would call bright. There was green above and green below, and the black of the water and the brown of the rot, and that was the whole palette of the living world. If these slow walks through the vanished forests are helping you towards sleep, this is the one moment I will ask anything of you. You can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It keeps the lamp lit for the next of these long nights. Now let the swamp draw you back down, into the warm dark air and the dripping fronds, and think no more about anything beyond the water in front of you. Return your attention to a single-scale tree, and follow it through its whole life, slowly, as a way of holding the age in one image. It began as a spore, one of millions released into that oxygen-thick air. It sprouted in the wet mud and sent down a strange forking base, an anchoring structure that spread through the peat to hold the coming height. Then it rose, fast, that green pressurized column climbing toward the light, mostly unbranched, gaining foot after foot. For most of its life it was a bare pole crowned with a tuft of long leaves, and it kept those leaves along its length until it grew, leaving the diamond scars behind as it shed them. Only near the end did it branch. High up, at last, the column forked into a crown of limbs, and on those limbs it bore its cones, and from the cones it loosed its spores into the wind and water. And then, its one great purpose met, it often died and fell. Down it came through the two canopies, tearing a bright gap in the green, and it struck the water and sank into the mud that had made it. There the airless dark took it in and held its carbon fast. That is the whole arc, rising and reaching and falling, repeated across 10,000 square miles of swamp for 60 million years. It is worth saying plainly, one more time, that for all their height, these were not trees in the way an oak is a tree. They were giant relatives of the small club mosses that today creep low across a forest floor, no taller than your ankle. In the Carboniferous, that same lineage stood taller than a 10-story building. The world had taken a humble group of spore-bearing plants and, given enough warmth and water and carbon, grown them into forests that fed the largest arthropods of all time and buried the carbon that would power a distant future. It was extravagance on a scale the land had never tried before, but no extravagance runs forever, and even as you stand here the conditions that made this world were quietly temporary. The swamps depended on warmth, on standing water, on tropical basins staying wet across the seasons. They depended on the continents holding their low, drowned lowlands open to the rain. none of that was permanent. The land was still drifting, still colliding, still rising and drying in slow motion far beyond the reach of any single life. The green excess of the Coal Age was a balance struck between climate and geography, and balances, given enough deep time, always shift. So take one last look from the black bank at the world before it changed. The two canopies stacked in the humid air, the diamond-scaled columns climbing into silence, the great fronds of the tree ferns hanging heavy with their freight of vines and epiphytes, the still black water, the dripping shade, the whir of a hawk-winged insect somewhere overhead, the slow scrape of an armoured giant through the litter, the air a third richer than any you will breathe, warm and wet as breath held in cupped palms, and beneath it all the coal thickening, patient, holding the carbon of a whole green age down in the dark. Stay low to the swamp floor a moment longer, down where fallen fronds rot slowly in black water. The air here is different. It is warm, wet, and unusually rich, carrying as much as 35% oxygen against the roughly 21% you breathe today. Something large is moving through the leaf litter ahead of you. You hear it before you see it. A long dry scrape and rustle, segment after segment, like a heavy rope being dragged across dead leaves. Then it slides into the green light, and it is enormous. This is Archaeopteris, the largest animal ever to walk on land without a backbone. Its armoured body runs on past 8 feet in length. Laid end to end, it would stretch longer than a bathtub set lengthwise on the swamp floor. Its back is wider than a dinner plate. Paleontologists at the Natural History Museum in London have described it plainly as car-sized. Nothing about that phrase is exaggeration for a listener falling asleep. It is simply how big this millipede grew. Its weight is harder to hold in mind than its length. The best estimates put Archaeopteris at around 110 pounds, roughly what a grown person weighs. Picture that mass carried on dozens of small legs, rippling in waves down both sides of the body. It does not rush. It grazes most likely, moving through rotting logs and low plant matter, cropping the soft green tissue and the spores that dust the mud. In this forest it has almost nothing to fear. There are no large predators built to bring down 100 pounds of armoured millipede, so it simply feeds, and the ground trembles faintly under it. Around you, the coal swamp presses close and dim. This is the Carboniferous, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, a stretch of deep time named for the coal its forests would become. Above the millipede rise the tall lycopsid scale trees, their trunks studded with diamond-shaped leaf scars. Beneath them stand tree ferns, their broad fronds cloaking the water in humid shade. And through that shade something moves that does not crawl. It flies. Lift your eyes from the litter and watch it pass. This is Meganeura, a griffinfly, a distant relative of the dragonflies that still stitch the air over ponds today. Its wingspan reaches somewhere between 26 and 30 inches. That is close to the wingspan of a hawk, drawn instead in the thin, veined membrane of an insect. Hold your own arms out to either side and measure the space between your fingertips. Meganeura, wingtip to wingtip, spans nearly that far. An insect as wide as your outstretched arms, banking between the scale trees. It hunts on the wing. With eyes wrapping most of its head and long-spined legs held ready like a basket, Meganeura almost certainly took smaller flying insects out of the air. Some researchers suspect the largest griffinflies could also snatch soft prey from the ground, small early amphibians and the like, though that remains a careful inference rather than a settled fact. What is not in doubt is the sound. Wings that broad, beating over standing water would have carried a low, dry whir, a heavy hum with real weight behind it. Listen to what is missing from that sound. There is no bird song here. There are no bird calls at all because birds do not yet exist and will not for well over 100 million years. There is no chirp of any mammal, no bark, no chatter, because the mammal line has barely begun, and nothing like it moves in these trees. The forest is loud, but its loudness is insect wings, running water, wind in the fronds, and the scrape of many legs. It is a soundscape built entirely from throats and mouths that have no voice, and from bodies simply moving through the wet. Follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and let the swamp keep breathing around you. Now hold the obvious question gently, because it has a real answer. Why here? Why does this one narrow window of deep time grow insects and their kin to the size of hawks and small cars, where nothing remotely so large flies or crawls today? The answer is written in the way these animals breathe. An insect does not have lungs, and it does not pump blood full of oxygen the way you do. Instead, its body is threaded with a network of fine tubes called tracheae. Air enters through small openings along the sides of the body and travels inward through those branching tubes, delivering oxygen directly to the tissues by diffusion. It is an elegant system, and for small bodies it works beautifully. But it has a built-in ceiling. As a body grows larger, the distance from the outside air to the deep interior grows longer. The tubes must reach further to feed the core. At some size, in ordinary air, the innermost tissues simply cannot be supplied fast enough. That ceiling is why the insects around you today are small. It is the quiet physical rule that keeps a beetle and a dragonfly a handspan wide. But a rule that depends on the richness of the air can be bent when the air itself changes. And in the Carboniferous, the air changed. The change came from the forests themselves. Across these swamps, plants were growing fast and dying into water so starved of oxygen that they barely rotted. Their carbon, instead of returning to the sky, was buried in the mud, layer over layer, the raw material that would slowly become coal. As that carbon locked away underground, the oxygen the plants had released stayed behind in the atmosphere. Over long ages, the free oxygen climbed up toward that remarkable figure of 35%. The whole planet was breathing differently. In air that rich, the tracheal ceiling lifts. Oxygen pushes deeper into a body along the same fine tubes, reaching tissues that thinner air could never have fed. The size limit relaxes. It does not vanish, and the giants are still shaped and constrained in ways researchers continue to study, but the door opens wider than it has ever opened before or since. Into that widened door step Meganeura on its hawk-wide wings, and Archaeopteris on its 100 legs, and a whole company of oversized relatives. So when you watch the griffinfly bank overhead, you're watching the atmosphere made visible. Its size is not a whim of evolution alone. It is a direct print of the oxygen pressed into these tubes, a living gauge of an ancient sky. The same is true of the great millipede grinding through the litter at your feet. Both are only possible because the coal forests are pulling carbon down and pushing oxygen up, quietly rewriting what a body on land is allowed to become. Walk the swamp in your mind and the giants keep appearing. There were griffinflies beyond Meganeura, others in the same wide-winged family patrolling other Carboniferous forests. There were early relatives of spiders and scorpions grown heavier than any you would meet today. There were mayfly-like insects with wings spanning many inches, drifting over the black water. Not every crawling thing was a giant, of course. The forest floor still swarmed with small mites and springtails and countless ordinary invertebrates. The same fine grain of little lives that any rich ecosystem needs. But the ceiling had lifted high enough that the largest could grow into shapes that would look to any later eye frankly impossible. Stand with Archaeopteris once more before you leave it. Watch the armoured plates slide over one another as it turns, each segment a curved shield, the whole body flexing like a train easing around a bend. It has no venom that anyone has found, no great jaws for hunting. It is a peaceful giant, most likely a vegetarian, made vast by nothing more sinister than good air and abundant food. In 100 million years of land animals since, nothing without a backbone has ever matched its length again. It stands, quietly, as the largest that lineage would ever produce, and all of it, the flying hawk of an insect, the bathtub-long millipede, the humid, loud, voiceless forest, rests on a single condition. It rests on the rich air, and the rich air rests on the forests, and the forests rest on a world that keeps burying its carbon instead of burning it. Pull any thread of that and the giants begin to shrink back toward the ordinary. The oxygen that lifted them was never a fixed feature of the planet. It was a passing gift of one particular age, an age of drowned wood and slow decay, held open only as long as the swamps themselves endured. For now, though, let it endure a little longer in your mind. Let Meganeura settle onto a scale tree trunk and fold its enormous wings. Let Arthropleura vanish back into the dark leaf litter, one long ripple of legs, then silence. Let the warm, heavy air sit in your chest, thick with the oxygen that made them, in a forest with no voice but wind and water and wings. These were the true monsters of the Coal Age, and they were built, every one of them, from the breath of the trees around them. The great coal forests could not last, and from their buried ruin rose plants that sealed their seeds against a drying world. The great coal forests could not last, and from their buried ruin rose plants that sealed their seeds against a drying world. Stand for a moment at the edge of what used to be swamp. The black water has pulled back into shallow, muddy channels. The soft ground that once swallowed your foot to the ankle has hardened and cracked into pale plates. Where the scale trees stood in flooded ranks, the earth is firmer now, dusted with fallen needles and brittle scales of bark. The air has lost its heavy, rotting sweetness. In its place drifts something sharper and cleaner, a resin scent, the smell of wounded conifer wood carried on a dry wind. You are standing at a hinge in the history of green life. The world is slowly learning to live without standing water everywhere, and the plants that will inherit it are already here. They are quiet about it. There is no sudden change of scenery, no single morning when the swamp becomes a forest of a different kind. Instead, there is a long, patient handover, measured across millions of years, in which one way of making more plants gives ground to another. The old way needed water. The leucopsids and tree ferns of the Coal Age released spores, single dust-fine cells that could only grow into the next generation where the ground stayed wet enough to keep them alive. Their whole world had been built for that. When the water withdrew, so did they. What replaced them carried its future differently, folded and sealed against the very dryness that was killing the swamps. Reach down and imagine holding that difference in your hand. A seed. Not a spore adrift on the damp air, but a small, self-contained package, a plant embryo wrapped with a supply of food and closed inside a protective coat. Curl your fingers around it. A seed is sealed as tight as a bead pressed inside a closed fist, dry on the outside, alive and waiting within. It does not need a film of water to survive the gap between parent and offspring. It can lie in the dust through a hard season and wait. When the rains finally return, it opens. That single innovation, a life held in reserve, is the quiet engine of everything that follows. The idea was older than the crisis that rewarded it. Far back in the late Devonian, roughly 400 million years ago, a modest plant called Alkinsia polymorpha had already begun to fold its unborn ovules into small protective cups, structures paleobotanists call cupules. Alkinsia is counted among the earliest known seed plants, one of the group casually named the seed ferns. Its cupules were the forerunner of the true seed, the first attempts at wrapping the next generation in armour. That single design let plant reproduction break free of its long dependence on standing water. For ages it was only one option among many in a world still ruled by spores. Then the world changed, and the option became the rule. We call the plants that carry naked seeds the gymnosperms, a word that means naked seed. Their seeds are naked in a very particular sense. They sit exposed on the scales of a cone or held in a fleshy cup, not sealed inside a fruit the way an apple seals its pips. This is the great green family that fills the chapters between the coal swamps and the flowers. Conifers, with their needles and cones. Cycads, squat and stiff, crowned with fronds like palms. The ginkgos, with their strange fan-shaped leaves, and the seed ferns, which looked like ferns but hid seeds among their foliage. For hundreds of millions of years, these were the great trees of the earth. They had been waiting in the wings through the whole age of coal, growing on the drier ground, on the low hills and river banks that never flooded, in the places the swamp plants could not reach. While the Lecopsids owned the wet lowlands, the early seed plants held the margins. When the climate tilted toward dryness at the close of the Paleozoic, those margins expanded until they became the whole stage. The seed-bearers were not sudden invaders. They were the patient tenants of the high ground, already in place when the water that had favoured their rivals drew back for good. And then came the filter. At the end of the Permian, the planet passed through the worst biological catastrophe in its history, a dying so severe that it nearly emptied both the seas and the land. Whole forests of the older kind were swept out of existence. The details are still debated, and much of the ancient plant record is patchy, but the direction is clear enough. The world grew hotter and drier and more hostile to anything that depended on gentle, constant moisture. Life on land was squeezed through a narrow gate, and most lineages did not fit. The seed was insurance against exactly that kind of season. Think again of the bead sealed inside your fist. When the ground bakes and the rains fail and the air turns to dust, a spore has no defense. It dries and dies. But a seed can hold. It can carry its embryo through the worst of a bad year, or a bad century, protected and provisioned, waiting for a window. When the seed-bearing plants and the spore-bearing plants met the same drought, the same heat, the same collapse, the ones with sealed seeds were far likelier to have offspring still viable on the far side. The extinction was a sieve, and the naked seeds slipped through where softer strategies could not. So the Triassic world that rose from the ruin was above all a world of gymnosperms. The double-decker canopy of the coal swamp, the towering scale trees over the shading tree ferns, was gone. In its place spread forests of conifers and cycads and ginkgos and their seed fern kin, plants built for seasons, for dry spells, for ground that was not always wet. The green of the world did not fail during the recovery. It simply changed its cast of characters, and the new cast was tougher, better sealed, more patient than the old. Among that new cast walked one lineage so enduring that a version of it still stands on Earth today. The ginkgo. Its family reaches back more than 290 million years into the Permian itself, which means the ginkgos were already ancient before the first dinosaur ever drew breath. Hold that span in your mind for a moment. A ginkgo lineage was rooted in the ground before the Great Extinction, survived the filter, and walked on into the age of the dinosaurs on the other side. It is one of the oldest witnesses in the whole gallery of living things. You can meet that witness now, in a way you can meet almost no other creature from so deep in time. By the Middle Jurassic, roughly 170 million years ago, ginkgo trees were growing fan-shaped leaves nearly identical in outline to the leaves of the single ginkgo species that survives today. Picture that leaf, a small green fan split down the middle, its veins spreading in fine parallel lines from the stalk toward the rim. A leaf of that exact shape lay on the ground of a Jurassic forest, the same shape a person can hold flat on a palm in the present. Almost nothing else lets you touch the deep past so directly, unchanged. Because the ginkgo predates the dinosaurs and outlived them, it makes a kind of quiet measuring stick for everything in between. When you imagine the seed-bearing forests of the Triassic, you can place a ginkgo in them and know you're not inventing anything. Its fans would have turned in the same dry wind that carried the resin scent. Its seeds, held in small fleshy cups, would have dropped and rolled across the hardening ground. A living lineage, passing through the same drought that killed so much else, carrying its future sealed and safe, the way all its seed-bearing cousins did. To feel the texture of that recovered world, let the setting sharpen around you. Leave the memory of the swamp behind entirely now. You're no longer standing in black water under a doubled canopy. You're standing on a floodplain, on the broad, flat lands beside slow rivers that wander across the country in wide, looping bends. Some of the year the channels run full. Some of the year they shrink to strings of ponds and quiet marshes, and the ground between them dries and pales in the sun. Water is no longer everywhere and always. It comes and goes with the seasons, and the forest has been built to live with that rhythm. One of the richest windows we have onto such a world lies preserved in the rocks of the American Southwest, in the late Triassic layers now called the Chinle Formation, exposed today across the painted country of northern Arizona. It is one of the finest fossil plant deposits of its age anywhere on Earth. Paleobotanists have identified more than 200 distinct kinds of plant from its beds, a whole flora frozen in stone. This was no thin, struggling scrubland. It was a full and varied living forest, layered and green, spread across a floodplain crossed by meandering rivers, dotted with marshes, swamps, ponds, and shallow lakes. Over that landscape rose one tree above the rest, a conifer given the tongue-twisting fossil name Archaeopteris arizonicum. It was the dominant giant of the Chinle forests, and its remains are the reason that country is famous. Its relatives still grow in the world today. It belongs to the same broad group as the modern monkey puzzle tree and the Norfolk Island pine, those stiff geometric conifers with branches arranged in neat tiers. In life, Archaeopteris may have resembled a medium-sized giant sequoia, a tall straight column of resin-rich wood lifting a crown of needled branches high over the floodplain. Stands of them once shaded the wandering rivers. Walk in under that crown and let your senses adjust. The floor is not the sucking mud of the coal age. It is firmer, littered with fallen needles that crunch faintly underfoot, streaked here and there with drifts of dry silt left by the last flood. The light comes down in hard, bright shafts between the tall trunks. The dominant smell is resin, the clean, sharp, slightly bitter scent of conifer sap, so different from the swamp's heavy rot. When you rest a hand against one of those great trunks, bark is dry and coarse under your palm. Conifer bark is rough as a cat's tongue drawn across your skin, a fine, dragging roughness that catches at the ridges of your fingers. Listen, and the forest is quiet in a way that is hard to imagine now. There is wind in the high-needled branches, a dry sighing rather than the wet drip of the swamp. There is the far mutter of a river working at its banks. There are the small dry sounds of a seasonal land, insects, the tick of a falling cone, the settle of loose sediment. There is no bird song because birds are still far in the future. The forest keeps its own hush, a green stillness lit by hard sun and scented with resin, waiting out the dry months until the water comes back to the low channels. That water, when it comes, does more than feed the trees. It is also what will make this forest immortal. On a floodplain like the Chinle, rivers in flood tear down whole trees and roll them along, then bury them in sediment, in mud and volcanic ash, before the wood can rot away. Sealed from oxygen, the buried logs do not decay. Instead, mineral-rich water seeps through them over ages, and cell by cell the wood is replaced by silica, by stone. What was living tissue becomes solid quartz that still holds the shape of every ring and grain. Those are the petrified logs, the great fallen columns of Archaeopteris that lie across the Arizona Badlands today, stone trees from a floodplain that dried and dried again more than 200 million years ago. We will not linger over that painted country now, because its full portrait waits for a later, closer look. It is enough here to know what it means. The Chinle forest is proof, cast in stone, that by the late Triassic the seed-bearers had not merely survived the great extinction. They had rebuilt the green world from the ground up, in their own image. Conifers towered. Cycads squatted in the understory with their stiff crowns. Ginkgos turned their small fans in the light. Seed ferns filled the gaps. Every one of them carried the same insurance, the sealed seed, the bead in the closed fist, the reason they had come through the filter when so much else did not. It is worth pausing on how strange this forest would feel to a modern eye, not for what it had, but for what it lacked. There were no flowers anywhere in it. Not one blossom, not one petal, not a single bright colour among the green and the brown and the grey of bare stone and bark. There was no grass on the ground, because grasses too lay far in the future. There was no fruit in the modern sense. no sweet flesh wrapped around a seed to tempt an animal into carrying it away. The seeds here were naked, held on cones and in bare cups, scattered by wind and gravity and the slow work of the rivers. The whole palette of the living world was green, and its shades, a forest that a person would find beautiful and profoundly, quietly foreign. And yet, for all its strangeness, it worked. It worked so well that this basic design, the gymnosperm forest of conifers and cycads and ginkgos, would rule the land for an immense stretch of time. Through the rest of the Triassic and onward, these were the dominant plants of the earth, the standard vegetation of the continents. They fed on sunlight and seasonal water. They locked carbon into resin-heavy wood. They sealed their offspring against drought and scattered them on the wind. They asked for nothing from any animal, because the great partnership between plants and pollinators had not yet been invented. This was a green world that ran entirely on air, light, and water. Think of the patience woven into that design, the sheer unhurried confidence of a seed. A conifer drops its cone, and the winged seeds spin down and lie on the dry floodplain floor. Most will never grow, but a few will wait, sealed and provisioned through the long dry season, through fire, through flood, until conditions turn kind. There is no rush in it, no urgency you would recognize. The plant simply casts its sealed futures onto the ground and lets deep time sort them. Over millions of years, that slow scattering built and rebuilt whole forests, again and again, across a drying world that would have starved the older spore bearers out of existence. You can feel, resting here in this Triassic hush, how much steadier this world is than the feverish coal swamp that came before. The Coal Age was a hothouse, wet and rank and crowded, its giant lecopsids racing skyward on soft water-filled trunks. The seed-bearing world is drier, cleaner, more measured. Its trees grow slower and harder, laying down true resinous wood ring by ring. Its rhythm is the seasonal pulse of the floodplain, swelling and shrinking of rivers, the annual round of flood and drought. It is a world you could imagine sleeping in, under the tall conifers, on a bed of fallen needles, in the resin-scented dark. And it is a world with a future stretching far ahead of it. The conifers and cycads and ginkgos that rebuilt the land after the Permian did not simply hold on. They flourished, and they diversified, and they spread across every continent as the Triassic gave way to the age that followed. The green architecture laid down on the Chinle floodplain, tall resinous conifers over stiff-crowned cycads, fan-leaved ginkgos turning in the wind, became the template for the forests of the entire early dinosaur world. When the great long-necked giants finally rose, this is the greenery they would walk out into, already ancient, already waiting. For now, let the Triassic forest settle around you one last time. Feel the dry needles under you. Smell the resin on the warm air. Rest your hand on that coarse trunk, rough as a cat's tongue against your skin, and feel the sealed seeds scattered somewhere in the dust nearby, each one a small closed fist holding a green life in reserve. The swamps have drained. The scale trees are gone. But the world is not less alive. It is only differently alive, sealed and patient and ready for what comes next. The land under your feet is dry and firm, packed sand rather than the black muck of the coal swamps. A river moves past, brown and unhurried, carrying fine sand down from far highlands. It bends across the plain in long slack curves, the way a rope loosens when you lay it on the ground. This is the late Triassic, in the country that will one day become northern Arizona. Around you stands a forest of tall conifers, and almost nothing in it would look familiar. The air is the first thing to notice. It is drier than the world you have been walking through. That heavy, dripping humidity of the coal forests is gone. In its place comes a seasonal warmth, a heat that swells through part of the year and then eases when the floodwaters rise. Water still lies everywhere across this plain, but it is river water and pond water now, not the endless still swamp of the Coal Age. Marshes glint between the trunks. Shallow lakes fill the low ground. Quiet ponds hold the colour of the sky. You smell resin before you understand the forest. It is a clean, sharp, faintly sweet scent, the smell of conifer wood bleeding sap in the sun. It rides on the warm air the way wood smoke carries on a cold morning, though there is no smoke here at all. Under it runs a second smell, softer and mineral. It is the smell of river mud drying at the water's edge, of wet sand and warmed pond water. There is no rot-heavy reek of swamp. This is a breathing, draining land, one that floods and then lets the water go. Then you look up, and the trees take the rest of your attention. The forest is ruled by a single kind of conifer, a tree known from its fossil wood as Archaeopteris arizonicum. Its trunk rises straight and clean for a great height before the first branches spread. Standing at the base, you feel the way you might feel at the foot of a medium-sized giant sequoia. There is that same slow tilt of the head. There is that same sense that the crown belongs to a separate world far overhead, sunlit and distant. This tree is a relative of plants that still live today. Its cousins are the monkey puzzle tree and the Norfolk Island pine, conifers with stiff geometric branches and hard scaled leaves. Reach out and set a hand against the bark, and the wood is warm from the day. In places the resin has welled up through cracks and pooled. Press a fingertip to it, and it is tacky as sap left in the sun, clinging and slow to let go, pulling a fine thread when you lift your hand away. That resin is doing quiet work. Over deep time, mineral-rich water will soak into fallen trunks of this species and turn them to stone, log by log, cell by cell, until they become the petrified wood that a place called Petrified Forest National Park is named for. Walk deeper, and the forest reveals that it is not one tree but many. The Chinle Formation, the great sheet of ancient floodplain rock that preserves this world, holds over 200 kinds of fossil plant. 200. It is one of the richest gatherings of Triassic plant life anywhere on Earth. Beneath the tall conifers grows a crowded understory of lower green things, ferns unrolling their fronds in the damp margins, seed-bearing plants with stiff, palm-like crowns, and the fan-leaved relatives of the ginkgo, whose lineage already reached back tens of millions of years before this moment. None of them flower, not one. That absence is the strangest thing about the forest, and the hardest to feel until you look for it. There are no blossoms anywhere, no petals, no bright lure of colour at the forest floor, no scent of nectar drifting on the warm air. There is no grass either. The ground between the trees is not the soft green lawn a later world would grow. It is bare sand, fallen needles, leaf litter, and the low sprawl of ferns and horsetails near the water. The whole palette of the place holds to two families of colour. There is the green of conifer and fern, dark and resinous and stiff, and there is the brown of floodwater and river mud and drying bark. Green and brown, water and wood under a hard bright sky. That is the entire painting. If you have walked with these episodes through the earlier chapters of the Green World, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Listen, now, and the forest gives you its second lesson, which is about sound. There is wind moving through the high conifer crowns, a dry rushing hiss quite unlike the wet drip of the coal swamps. There is the low constant voice of the river, sliding its sand along the bends. Water laps at the edges of the ponds, something disturbs the shallows, and a ring of ripples widens and fades against the mud. But there is no bird song. Birds do not exist yet. There is no chorus of the kind a modern forest wears at dawn. The sounds here are the sounds of water, wind, and wood, and the occasional stir of animal life you cannot quite place, moving somewhere out among the trunks. Feel the rhythm of the year, because this forest lives by it. The late Triassic floodplain runs on seasons, wet and dry, in a way the drowned coal forest never did. For part of the year the rivers stay low and the ground bakes and the heat presses down and pulls more resin sweating from the bark. Then the season turns, and the rivers rise and spill across the flats, spreading a thin brown sheet of water and fine sediment over the low ground. That flooding is the reason so much of this world was saved. Sand and mud settle over fallen trunks and buried leaves, sealing them away from the air, holding them still long enough for stone to take their place. You're standing inside a landscape that is quietly turning itself into a fossil bed while you watch. Set your hand against one of the great conifer trunks again, and let the scale settle into your body. These are among the tallest living things in this world, rising many times your own height before the branches even begin. Yet the tree is not built quite like the pines and firs that will come later. It belongs to an older order of conifer, one whose closest survivors now cling to a few far corners of the southern world. When one of these giants falls, whether by flood, by wind, or by the slow undermining of the river, it comes down across the plain with enormous weight, and it lies there, resin still bleeding from its wounds, waiting for the water to bury it. Some of those fallen trunks stretch well over 100 feet along the ground. Hold in your mind, as you stand here, how far this is from the swamp world that came before. The coal forests were flooded, humid and green all the way to the ground, roofed by strange trees held up by soft tissue rather than true wood. This Chinley forest is drier, harder and cleaner in its lines. Its trees are true conifers with true wood, seed-bearing plants that no longer need standing water to breed. Their seeds ride the wind and wait in the dry season for the rains to come. That single change, the freeing of reproduction from the need for water, is what let green life climb up off the swamp margins and spread across seasonal floodplains like this one, out under an open and often thirsty sky. And this is not a quiet backwater of the living world. It is close to the centre of it. The late Triassic is the age when the first dinosaurs are finding their feet, small and swift among these very trunks, still sharing the land with older reptile lineages. The forest you are standing in, resin-scented and river-crossed, and utterly without flowers, is the kind of forest the earliest dinosaurs actually knew. It is the green they moved through, the shade they rested in, the fallen needles they trod. When you picture the dawn of the dinosaurs, picture this: conifer green, floodwater brown, the smell of sap in the heat, and no colour of a blossom anywhere in the whole wide world. Let the light lower now, and watch the plain go gold, and then grey, as the sun drops behind the distant highlands. The river keeps sliding, the resin keeps its slow seep. The ponds hold the last of the sky, then let it go. This forest of conifers, cycad-like plants, ferns and ginkgos, all of them seed-bearers, all of them flowerless, will not stay confined to the Triassic. Its kind will spread and thicken and grow taller still in the ages that follow, until the tall conifer stands become the standing food of a coming world of giants. By the Jurassic, these seed-bearing forests had become the everyday pasture of the largest animals ever to walk the earth. By the Jurassic, these seed-bearing forests had become the everyday pasture of the largest animals ever to walk the earth. Picture the light first. It falls green and filtered, sifted through needle and frond, warm across the forest floor. A long-necked sauropod stands inside that light. Its head is lifted into the crown of a conifer, and its jaws close on a spray of foliage and strip it clean. There is no birdsong above it. There is no hum of a bee, because no bee has yet found a flower to visit. The forest is vast and quiet and green, and it smells of resin, of crushed leaf, of warm damp soil. You're standing in a world that has one great absence you might never notice from the inside. There are no flowers anywhere, not one. No petal has opened in any clearing, on any slope, at the edge of any river. The colour scheme of the whole land is narrow and calm, green in 100 shades, brown in the bark and the litter, the grey of bare stone where a slope has slipped. That is nearly all of it. For an animal grazing here, this is not a loss. It is simply the way the world looks, the only way it has ever looked. Let your eye move slowly across the stand. Close to the ground grow the cycads, squat and patient. Each one carries a crown of stiff fronds that fan out from a single thick trunk, and from a distance you might mistake them for palms. They are not palms. Palms will not exist for well over 100 million years, because palms are flowering plants, and flowering plants have not arrived. These are gymnosperms, seed bearers of an older kind, and their fronds are hard and waxy and slow to spoil. Run a hand along one and it resists you. The leaflets are stiff as the ribs of a folded fan, each one held rigid on its stem, built to last through drought and browse and the weight of a passing season. Above the cycads rise the conifers, and these are the tall architecture of the Jurassic world. Some are relatives of trees you could still find today, kin to the monkey puzzle and the Norfolk Island pine, with branches held in stiff symmetrical whorls and needles packed tight along every twig. They lift their crowns high into the light and cast long shade beneath. Their trunks are true wood, dense and resinous, and when a branch snaps, the wound weeps a slow amber sap that smells sharp and clean. This is the canopy a sauropod reaches for. This is the height that a neck the length of a long room was built to graze, and scattered between them, catching the light in a different way, stand the ginkgos. Their leaves are unmistakable. Each one is a small green fan split down the middle, veined in fine lines that spread outward from the stem like the spokes of something patiently made. A ginkgo leaf is almost nothing in the hand. It is light enough to balance on a single fingertip and let the breeze lift it away. The tree that holds it, though, is old beyond easy imagining, older as a lineage than the dinosaurs themselves. This is the everyday green that fed the giants, and the Jurassic is so thick with one of its plants that paleontologists sometimes give the whole span a nickname. They call it the age of cycads. It is a slight exaggeration, the way all such nicknames are, because conifers and ferns and ginkgos share the ground too, but it captures something true. Cycads were everywhere. They were the low pasture, the understory browse, the reliable green that a herbivore could crop without climbing or reaching. For the plated stegosaurs walking these forests, heads held low, that low pasture was the whole menu spread out at chest height. Think about what that means for the animals. A stegosaur moves through the stand with its small head swinging near the ground, its back ridged with tall bony plates, its tail tipped with spikes. It is not built to reach a conifer crown. It is built to graze the cycads and the ferns and the low soft growth, to work slowly across a clearing the way a grazing animal always does, taking a mouthful, stepping, taking another. Nearby a sauropod does the opposite, lifting its head into the trees the stegosaur can never touch. Between the two of them, high brows and low, the forest is eaten from top to bottom, and every bite of it is a gymnosperm. That word matters, so let it settle. Gymnosperm means naked seed, a seed carried on a scale or in a cone rather than wrapped inside a fruit. The conifers are gymnosperms, the cycads are gymnosperms, the ginkgos are gymnosperms. The seed ferns and their relatives, still scattered through these forests, belong to the same broad company, and these were the only options on the table. When a Jurassic sauropod filled its enormous body, it filled it entirely with gymnosperm tissue, because the alternative did not yet exist. There was no grass to graze, because grasses are flowering plants. There was no fruit to strip from a branch, because fruit is the invention of flowering plants. There was no soft, broad angiosperm leaf, no nectar, no blossom. The giants ate the flowerless world because the flowerless world was all there was. You might wonder how a body that large ran on food like that. Cycad fronds are tough. Conifer needles are waxy and resinous, defended by their own chemistry. This is not tender food. It is slow food, hard to break down, and researchers have spent real effort trying to understand it. There is a line of study that revisits the digestibility of dinosaur food plants, that takes the living relatives of these ancient gymnosperms and measures how much energy an animal could actually pull from them. The work is careful and a little surprising. Some of these plants, fermented long enough in a large gut, yield far more than you would guess by chewing a leaf and finding it bitter. A sauropod did not chew much at all. It cropped, it swallowed, and it let time and its own vast interior do the rest. The body was, in a sense, a warm, slow tank where tough gymnosperm leaves became fuel over days. That is the quiet engineering behind the giants. Not powerful jaws, but enormous patience built into the gut. A neck to gather food across a wide reach without moving the heavy body. A digestive system long enough to wring a living from leaves that a smaller, faster animal could never afford to eat. The flowerless forest was hard to digest, and so the animals that ruled it grew the interior room to digest it slowly. Size was, in part, an answer to the toughness of the only food there was. Now walk back to the ginkgos for a moment, because their tale is worth telling slowly. The story of the ginkgo is a tale of almost impossible stillness. Its lineage reaches back more than 290 million years, into the Permian, into a world before any dinosaur had taken a single step. That alone would make it ancient. But there is something stranger than mere age. By the Middle Jurassic, roughly 170 million years ago, ginkgo leaves appear in the fossil record in a shape you would recognize instantly. Not similar, essentially the same. The split fan, the fine spreading veins, the little notch at the top edge. A ginkgo leaf from 170 million years ago and a ginkgo leaf you could hold today are, in outline, the same object. Let that land against the scene around you. When a sauropod moved its great head through a Jurassic stand and brushed past a low ginkgo bough, the leaf that trembled against its cheek was, in shape, the leaf you could pick up from a sidewalk in autumn. The animal is gone, and its whole world is gone, and the shape of that little green fan simply stayed. It kept its form through the end of the dinosaurs, through the rise of the mammals, through ice ages and the slow drift of continents, and it is with us now, nearly unchanged, a living witness to the flowerless age carried forward on a stem. There are not many things you can hold in your hand that a sauropod would have known by sight. A ginkgo leaf is one of them. Because the ginkgo is a gymnosperm too, it makes its seeds the old way, without a flower and without a fruit in the true sense. And so, standing here, you can gather the whole absence into a single calm inventory. There are no petals in these forests. Look as long as you like along the ground and up the trunks and out to the horizon, and you will not find one. There is no fruit hanging ripe from any branch. There is no grass underfoot, no green blade bending in the wind across an open meadow, because meadows of grass do not yet exist and will not for ages. And there is no scent of blossom anywhere. Not on the warm air of morning, not in the cool of evening. The forest is fragrant with resin and leaf and earth, and that is the entire perfume of the world. It is easy to think of that as bare, but stand in it a while, and it is not bare at all. It is full. It is layered from the litter to the canopy, thick with cycad and conifer and ginkgo and fern, humming with insects that visit no flowers because there are none to visit. The absence is real, but the fullness is real too. This is simply a green built on a different plan, a world that solved the problem of covering a planet in life without ever once opening a petal to do it. You can feel that difference in your hands if you let yourself imagine touching it. A conifer twig is stiff and prickling, its needles firm and slightly oily, and it holds its shape when you close your fingers around it. A cycad frond is harder still, almost architectural, each leaflet standing off the central rib with the rigid regularity of something folded and pressed. Set that against the ginkgo leaf, which weighs almost nothing, which lies across your palm like a scrap of green paper and lifts on the smallest breath of moving air. 3 textures, 3 weights, and not a soft petal among them. This is the tactile world the giants moved through, all leather and needle and stiff green fan. The animals wore that world into their own bodies in ways that later survived as stone. Here the record does something remarkable. It hands you across an unthinkable gap of time the actual contents of a plant-eater's last meal. Move forward now out of the deep Jurassic and into the early Cretaceous, to a forest of about 110 million years ago. An armoured dinosaur is walking there, a nodosaur low and broad, and covered across the back and flanks in bony plates, a living tank grazing the undergrowth. Paleontologists have given it a name, Borealopelta, and through an extraordinary accident of preservation they have been able to open its stomach and read what it ate before it died. What they found is precise enough to feel like eavesdropping on a single afternoon. The stomach was dominated, close to 9/10 of it, by chewed fern leaf. A smaller share, a fraction of the whole, was stems and twigs. Mixed through it were smooth-swallowed stones, gizzard stones, the gastroliths that ground the tough plant matter in the animal's gut, and through it all ran charcoal, burned material, the signature of a landscape that had recently caught fire. Ferns are among the first plants to flush back green after a burn, springing up quickly on the blackened ground, and this animal had been grazing exactly that fresh regrowth, cropping tender new fern low across a scorched forest floor, swallowing char along with the leaves. Consider what that stomach preserves. Not a general idea of a diet, but a moment. The blackened taste of fresh fern on burned ground, the grit of stones in the gut, the low crop of an animal feeding close to the earth on the softest green it could find. It is nearly the closest thing science has to standing inside a single meadow of the flowerless world, in the last hour before that meadow's memory was fixed forever in rock. And the ferns it ate were not flowering plants either. They were the old spore-bearing green, still thriving, still the fast pioneer after fire, exactly as they had been for hundreds of millions of years before any dinosaur came to crop them. There is one more detail in that stomach worth holding, because it is quietly eloquent about the whole age. Around this armoured animal, in its early Cretaceous forest, other plants were available. There were conifers, there were cycads, there were ginkgos, that patient fan-leaved lineage still going strong. The animal could have eaten any of them, but it had not. It had gone for the fern regrowth on the burn, chosen it, sought it out, the way a modern grazer chooses one patch of ground over another. Even here, among giants, diet was a choice made among the plants that a flowerless world provided, and every one of those plants was a gymnosperm or a fern. The list had no flowers on it, because the world had no flowers to offer. Stand back once more and take in the scale of what that means across time. For the whole long reign of the sauropods, through the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, the largest animals ever to walk the earth were built and fueled entirely by seed plants without flowers and by ferns without seeds at all. Every colossal body, every impossible neck, every plated back and clubbed tail was grown out of cycad and conifer and ginkgo and fern. The green that carpeted the continents and fed the giants was the naked seed green, the older invention, the one that had already ruled the land for ages before the first dinosaur and would keep ruling it while they walked. You can hear the quiet of that world if you listen for what is missing. There is wind moving through needle and frond, a dry rustle high in the conifer crowns, a softer whisper down among the cycads. There is the heavy tread of large animals and the tearing sound of foliage stripped from a branch. There is the drone of insects working the resin and the litter, but there is no sound that depends on flowers, no visit to a blossom, no fruit dropping ripe to the ground with a soft, heavy fall. The forest keeps its own older music, and the giants move through it slowly, grazing, resting, grazing again, under a canopy that has never once bloomed. And it is worth being calm and honest about the edges of what we know, because paleobotany is a science of fragments. We read these forests from leaves pressed flat in stone, from petrified trunks, from pollen so small it takes a microscope to see, from the rare gift of a preserved stomach. The broad picture is firm. Gymnosperms and ferns ruled, flowers were absent. The giants ate the flowerless green. But the fine detail of exactly which plant grew where, and exactly which the largest animals preferred from season to season, is reconstructed patiently and sometimes revised. When the record is thin, the careful voice says so and holds the picture loosely where the stone allows only a guess. What is not in doubt is the shape of the age. Picture it whole one last time before we move on. A planet clothed pole to pole in green with no colour but green and brown and grey. Forests of stiff-crowned cycads and tall resinous conifers, and fan-leaved ginkgos, standing in warm air that carries the scent of sap and leaf and earth, and nothing else. Enormous animals moving through those forests with the unhurried confidence of things that have never known the world to be any other way, cropping the high crowns and the low understory, filling their vast bodies with the only food there has ever been. No petal, no fruit, no grass, no blossom on the wind. Only the deep, unbroken, flowerless green, holding the whole living land in its patient hands, exactly as it had for something close to 300 million years. It could seem from inside that green that nothing would ever change it. The forests were ancient. The animals were the largest that had ever lived. The plan of naked seeds and needled crowns and fern regrowth after fire had worked for so long that permanence would feel less like a hope than a fact. Nothing in the sound of the wind or the smell of the resin would warn a grazing giant otherwise. Consider what it means to know, for certain, what a single animal ate on the last day of its life, 110 million years ago. Not a guess from tooth shape, not an inference from the shape of a jaw. The actual meal, chewed and swallowed, held in place through deep time. That is what paleontologists found inside Borealopelta macmicheli, the armoured nodosaur pulled from the Suncor Millennium mine in Alberta in 2011. Somewhere below the ribs, where the gut had been, sat a compact mass about the size of a soccer ball. Inside it was a meadow, frozen mid-digestion. To read that mass, you have to understand what survives and what does not. Soft tissue almost never lasts. Leaves are mostly water and fragile cell walls, and they rot within days on a forest floor. But plants carry one part built to endure, the cuticle. It is the thin, waxy skin that coats a leaf, sealing in moisture, and it is chemically stubborn in a way the rest of the plant is not. When everything softer has collapsed, the cuticle can remain, printed with the exact pattern of the cells it once covered. That pattern is a signature, and every kind of plant signs its name differently. So the work begins with the thinnest possible slices. A fragment of the stomach mass is embedded, sectioned, and set under a microscope, and the researcher looks not at the leaf but at the ghost of its surface. Fern cuticle has its own architecture. The cells sit in particular shapes, and the little breathing pores, the stomata, are arranged and spaced in ways that differ from a conifer or a cycad. A conifer needle wears a thick, tough cuticle with stomata sunk into neat rows, built to hold water through dry spells. A cycad frond carries a heavier, more rigid skin again. Under magnification, these are not vague impressions. They are distinct enough that a trained eye can look at a scrap smaller than a grain of rice and say, with confidence, this was a fern, and this was not. Picture the patience of it. You are turning over pieces of a meal that was ground up before it was buried, then compressed for 100 million years. Reading it is like handling a book that was dropped in water and then dried stiff. The pages have fused into a solid block. You cannot simply open it. You ease one leaf away from the next, and much of the writing is smeared, but here and there a line survives clear enough to read. You gather those legible lines, hundreds of them, and slowly the sentence assembles. The sentence, in this case, was overwhelmingly fern. That is how the numbers came. When the team counted the identifiable plant fragments across many slices, the meal resolved into proportions. Roughly 88% of it was chewed fern leaf. About 7% was stems and twigs. The woodier stuff a browsing animal takes along with the soft fronds. The rest was scattered odds and ends. That kind of quantified diet is genuinely rare in paleontology. Most of the time you can only say an animal probably ate plants, or probably ate meat, from the broadest clues. Here you could put a figure on it. Not a menu built from guesswork, but a measured breakdown of one animal's actual last feeding, sorted leaf by leaf. And the ferns tell you something about choice. Borealopelta did not live in a fern-only world. Its landscape held conifers, tall and resinous. It held cycads with their stiff crowns. It held ginkgos, fan-leaved and ancient, whose shape had barely changed in 100 million years and would barely change again. All of that was within reach, yet the gut was not a random sweep of whatever grew nearby. It was fern, and mostly fern, with the tougher gymnosperm foliage almost absent. This animal was selecting. It cropped the soft, fast-growing leaves and largely left the needles and the fronds alone. You are watching a preference, preserved. Then there were the stones. Mixed through the plant mass sat gastroliths, smooth pebbles the animal had swallowed on purpose. A nodosaur had no grinding teeth worth the name. Its mouth could crop and snip, but it could not chew tough plant matter into pulp the way a cow does. So the grinding happened deeper, in a muscular chamber of the gut, the gizzard, where swallowed stones did the work that teeth could not. The plant material tumbled against the stones, and the stones against each other, mashing fibrous leaves into something the body could break down. You can recognize a gastrolith by its polish. Ordinary rock in sediment stays rough and angular. A gizzard stone is worn smooth and rounded, buffed by months or years of grinding inside a living animal. Find a cluster of them nested in the plant mass, and you are looking at the animal's internal mill still loaded with its last grist. That single detail rewrites how you imagine the creature feeding. It was not simply biting and swallowing. It was running an entire processing system, stones and muscle standing in for the molars it lacked, turning stiff Cretaceous ferns into fuel for a body sheathed in bone. The tough plants of the flowerless world demanded that. Without flowers, without soft fruit, without grass, a large plant-eater faced a diet of fibrous, defended foliage. The gizzard and its stones were the answer, and in Borealopelta you can hold that answer in your hand. Wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, you can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and let the deep time keep unspooling while you rest. There was one more ingredient in the mass, and it turned a meal into a scene: charcoal. Fine black flecks of burned plant matter scattered through the ferns the animal had eaten. Charcoal in a gut is not something an animal seeks out. It arrives because the animal was feeding on ground that had recently burned, and here the reconstruction stops being a menu and becomes behaviour. Ferns are among the first plants to return after a fire. Their underground parts survive the heat, and within weeks they push up fresh green fronds into the open, sunlit soil, while slower plants are still absent. That flush of new fern growth is soft, tender and abundant, exactly the kind of low, easy forage a cropping herbivore would favour. So the charcoal and the fern, read together, place the animal in a specific landscape at a specific moment. Not just a forest, but a burned patch of forest, blackened and reopened, greening again from the ashes. Borealopelta had been walking that scorched ground, head low, cropping the young ferns that carpeted it, swallowing flecks of char along with the leaves. That is a scene, not a statistic. You can almost feel the setting. Warm soil still holding the memory of fire, the smell of wet ash, bright new fronds uncurling, and a low-armoured animal moving through them, feeding. A window of maybe a few hours from the end of its life, recovered from the inside of its body. None of this comes from imagination filling gaps. It comes from stacking independent lines of evidence until they point the same way. The cuticle identifies the plants. The counting turns identity into proportion. The gastroliths reveal the machinery of digestion. The charcoal reveals the setting and the timing. Each is a separate reading, and each could be wrong on its own, but together they converge on a single coherent picture. That convergence is what gives paleontologists confidence. When 4 different clues, drawn from 4 different kinds of evidence, all describe the same animal on the same burned ground eating the same young ferns, the picture stops being a hypothesis and starts being a record. It helps, too, to remember how unusual this preservation is. Guts almost never fossilize. They are the first thing to decay, dissolved by the animal's own acids and bacteria before burial can even begin. For a stomach mass to survive intact, the animal had to be buried fast and sealed off from decay almost immediately, which is why Borealopelta came out of the ground looking less like a skeleton and more like a statue, skin and armour and all. Most dinosaurs left us only bones, and from bones you can reason toward diet but never truly confirm it. This one left the meat itself. That is why the study drew such attention. It was not another estimate of what an armoured dinosaur might have browsed. It was the thing itself, counted and named, and what it named was a world entirely without flowers. 88% fern, a scatter of stems and twigs, grinding stones and ash. No petals in the mass, no fruit, no seeds wrapped in sweet flesh, because such things did not yet exist in any abundance an animal could feed on. The plants that fed the giants were the old plants, the ferns and the conifers, and the cycads and the ginkgos, the green survivors of a lineage far older than any bloom. When you read the inside of this one animal, you are reading the diet of an entire age, the last long chapter of a planet clothed only in green and brown, before colour and scent arrived to change how everything grew and everything fed. Ferns filled the burned ground, and conifers held the high canopy, and the world went on as it had for hundreds of millions of years. Dawn comes slowly to this Jurassic morning, and nothing announces it. There is no voice to break the grey. You stand at the edge of a clearing where the light has not yet found its colour. The air is cool and damp against your face. Mist lies in the low places between the trees, and it moves when a larger thing moves through it. That larger thing is a sauropod. It is already awake. It was awake before the light, and it will be moving long after. You feel its size before you understand it. The ground carries the animal to you first, a slow pressure through the soles of your feet spaced far apart, patient. Then the shape lifts out of the mist. The neck comes first, held low and level, swinging like a slow beam across the green. The body follows, a warm grey wall of muscle and hide wider than you can take in without turning your head. You are standing beside something that does not notice you at all. Around it grows the forest that fed the age of the giants. There are cycads here, squat and thick-trunked. Their crowns spread into stiff whorls that look like the fronds of a palm held rigid in the air. There are conifers behind them, tall and dark and straight, climbing far past the reach of the mist into a sky that is only beginning to pale. And scattered between there are ginkgos, their branches hung with small fans of leaves split down the middle, the exact shape a modern hand could still fold around today. That leaf has not changed in a very long time. By the middle of the Jurassic, roughly 170 million years ago, the ginkgo already wore the same fan it wears now. The sauropod lowers its head into a stand of cycads. You watch the jaw work, and you notice what it does not do. It does not chew, it rakes. The teeth close on a mouthful of stiff frond, and the head pulls back, and the fronds strip away from the plant with a dry tearing sound. There is no grinding, no slow working of the cud. The animal simply crops and swallows, and lets the vast dark warmth of its gut do the patient work that its mouth will not. You move a little closer, and the plants let you know it. A cluster of ferns stands between you and the animal, waist high, heavy with the night's wet. As you pass, the fronds drag along your side, and it is the feeling of wet grass pulled against a bare shin, cool and clinging and then gone. That same green brushes the sauropod's flank as it steps, and the animal does not so much as flinch. What soaks you to the skin is nothing to it. Now the smell reaches you. A branch of conifer has been snapped somewhere ahead, cracked by the swing of that enormous neck, and the break has opened the wood. The resin comes off it sharp and clean and faintly bitter. The scent of crushed needles and cut sap, thick enough to sit at the back of your throat. It is the smell of the Jurassic morning. There is no perfume under it. There is no sweetness of any flower, because in this world there is no flower to give one. That absence is the thing you notice most, once you begin to notice it. You wait for a bird out of habit, and no bird comes. No song threads through the branches. No warble, no chirp, no rising call to mark the light. The trees are full and green and utterly without a chorus, because the singers have not yet been made. What sound there is comes from the plants and the wind and the animal itself. The wind moves through the conifer tops with a long dry hush, high above you. The cycad fronds rasp against each other, a papery scrape, stiff leaf on stiff leaf. And under all of it runs the sauropod's breathing, slow and deep and enormous. He bellows the size of a room, drawing the cool air in and letting it go. You look for colour too, and there is none to find. Only green in every depth the eye can hold, the near green of the wet ferns at your feet, the blue-green of the cycad crowns, the dark, almost black green of the conifers against the paling sky. And where the green gives out there is only brown and grey, the brown of bark and fallen frond, the grey of trunk and stone and the last of the mist. No red berry hangs in the shade, no white petal catches the coming light, no yellow, no orange, no blue that a growing thing has made on purpose to be seen. The whole forest is built to catch light and to make seed, and it does both without ever once being bright. And there is no fruit. You could walk a full day through this stand and find nothing soft and swollen and sweet grown up around a seed. The seeds here are the naked seeds of the old plants, held bare on the scales of a cone, or clustered on a cycad stiff cone in the centre of its crown, or hung as small hard kernels among the ginkgo's fans. Nothing wraps them in flesh. Nothing offers a meal in exchange for carrying a seed away. This is a world that has learned 100 ways to be green, and not one way to be a berry. The sauropod does not miss what has never existed. It swings its neck to a fresh cycad and crops again, and the sound repeats, tear and swallow, tear and swallow. You begin to understand the arithmetic of an animal this large. A body like this cannot be choosy. It cannot spend its day hunting for the tenderest shoot. It must take great mouthfuls of whatever the forest offers most, the tough fronds and the resinous needles and the fan leaves, and it must take them nearly without stopping, from the first grey light until the dark. The neck is the tool that makes this possible. Held out level, it lets the animal stand in one place and strip a whole arc of forest clean, reaching from the low cycads up into the lower conifer branches without moving those pillar legs at all. You notice, in the quiet, how little of that food is spent on show. Every leaf around you exists for one plain purpose, to gather the light and to pass a seed forward into the next season. None of it advertises, none of it flowers. This is the deep habit of the plant world, the way it had worked for a very long time already, through the drying of the Permian and across the whole long stretch of the Triassic, and now here, in the warm Jurassic, feeding the largest animals ever to walk on land. Cycads and conifers and ginkgos, the naked seeded plants holding the whole green world in their keeping. The light strengthens while you stand there. The mist thins and lifts off the low ground, and the greys begin to warm, though the warmth only makes the green more green. It does not add a single new colour to the scene. The sauropod feeds through the change without marking it, its great side rising and falling, the breath going in and out, fronds tearing free one mouthful at a time. At last the animal slows. It has been feeding since before you arrived, and something in the vast machine of it is satisfied for now. The neck rises, unhurried, and swings once across the clearing, as if reading the wind. Then it lowers again, not to feed this time, but to rest. The huge body settles by degrees. One foreleg bends. The bulk lowers toward the churned ground with a care that seems impossible for a thing so large, and the earth takes the weight with a long soft compression you feel through your feet. You settle too, near enough to stay inside the warmth the animal throws off, far enough to be nothing to it. The breathing slows further and deepens. The tail lies out behind through the ferns, and the fronds close over it, wet and green. Above you the conifer tops keep up their dry hush. The cycads rasp. The ginkgo fans turn slightly in the moving air, showing their split edges, then their faces, then their edges again. And still there is no song. There is only the wind, and the rasp of the foliage, and the slow tide of the sleeping animal's breath, in and out, filling the whole clearing with the sound of something enormous at rest. You let your own breathing find that rhythm. You are inside a green world that has held itself this way for tens of millions of years, complete, self-sufficient, and quiet. A world that has never needed a flower and does not know that it lacks one. You could believe, lying here, that it would always be so, that the forest had found its final shape long ago and would keep it forever. Green over brown over grey, seed held bare on the cone, no fruit, no petal, no scent but resin and wet leaf, no sound but wind and breath. It is easy, in the hush of this settled morning, to think that nothing here will ever be any different than it is. But somewhere in that unbroken green, a new kind of plant was already learning to fold a seed inside a fruit. But somewhere in that unbroken green, a new kind of plant was already learning to fold a seed inside a fruit. But somewhere in that unbroken green, a new kind of plant was already learning to fold a seed inside a fruit. But somewhere in that unbroken green, a new kind of plant was already learning to fold a seed inside a fruit. To find the first sign of it, you have to lower yourself into a shallow lake in what is now central Spain, roughly 130 million years ago. The water is cool and slow and very clear. Long, weedy strands sway below the surface, bending with the current like wet hair combed gently sideways. They never rise into the open air. They never lift a petal toward the sun. If these plants flower at all, they do it down here, in the soft green underwater light, where almost nothing is watching. This plant is called Montsecchia vidali. It may be the oldest flower anyone has ever found. Look closely, and it does not look like a flower at all. There are no petals. There is no nectar, no perfume, no bright colour thrown up into the daylight to catch an insect's eye. There is only a modest aquatic stem set with small stiff leaves, rooted in the pale mud of a Cretaceous lake bed. For most of a century, these fossils were treated as just one more pondweed, another scrap of green in an endlessly green world. But tucked along those quiet stems was something no plant of the older world had ever built. Each one carried tiny fruit-like structures, and inside each of those sat a single seed, wrapped and enclosed and shielded from the water around it. That wrapping is the whole secret. That small enclosure is the exact thing that separates a flowering plant from everything that had come before. Stay with that image for a moment before we go any further, the seed folded quietly inside its little case, because the rest of this long chapter turns on it. You do not need to remember any names tonight. You only need to feel how small and how patient this beginning was. To understand why a wrapped seed matters so much, you have to remember what every earlier seed plant did instead. The conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, the seed ferns before them, all of them made what botanists call a naked seed. The ovule sat exposed on a scale or a cone, open to the air, waiting for a grain of pollen to drift down and reach it directly. It worked for hundreds of millions of years. It fed the great forest the sauropods walk through, but it left the seed uncovered, undefended, with no soft casing built around it. The flowering plants closed that gap. They tucked the ovule inside a sealed chamber called a carpel, and after fertilization that chamber could swell and harden and ripen into a fruit. The seed rode inside, cushioned, hidden, carried. It was a small change in architecture and an enormous change in possibility. And in Montsecchia, in a Spanish lake bed some 130 million years old, you can already see it happening, quietly, underwater, without a single petal to announce it. Now hold this fruit in your mind at its true size. It was not the swollen apple or plum your hand knows today. It was a fruit smaller than the nail on your smallest finger, barely a speck against the green blur of the water. Nothing about it looked like the future. Nothing about it looked like it would remake the surface of the entire planet. It simply sat there, sealed and waiting, in the cool current of the early Cretaceous. Now carry that image east, across an ocean and a stretch of years, to the lake beds of northeastern China. Here, in the rocks of the Ixian Formation, roughly 125 million years old, lies another candidate for the title of first flower. Its name is Archaeopteris sinensis, and like Montsechia, it refuses to look the way you expect a flower to look. The Ixian beds are famous for stillness. Fine volcanic ash settled again and again over quiet lakes, sealing whatever sank there in exquisite detail. Feathered dinosaurs were buried in these layers, their outlines pressed into stone, and among them, flattened and preserved with astonishing clarity, lay this slender water plant, its stems and delicate reproductive parts laid out like a diagram. Archaeopteris had no petals. It had no sepals, none of the outer leafy wrapping you picture cupping a bloom. If you saw it swaying in life, you would not have called it a flower at all. You would have called it a thin green weed reaching up through shallow water, and yet it carried the two structures that truly define a flower, deep at its heart, where it counts. It bore stamens, the pollen-bearing parts paired along its stalks, and it bore carpels, those same sealed chambers holding the ovules safe inside. Stamens and carpels together are the working machinery of a flower, the engine underneath all the colour and scent we usually notice first. Archaeopteris had the engine and skipped the decoration. It was a flower stripped down to the parts that actually mattered, so now you have two ancient plants, on two future continents, both aquatic, both plain, both petalless, and both laying claim to the same crown. And here the honest answer is the interesting one. Which of them is truly older, which is more primitive, which deserves the title of the first flower, is simply not settled. The dating tells you why. Montsechia comes in around 130 million years ago. Archaeopteris comes in around 125 million years ago. On the surface that looks like a clear 5 million year lead. But at this depth of time, our dating is not sharp enough to trust a gap that thin. The error bars overlap. Some careful reanalysis argues that Montsechia is at least as old as Archaeopteris, and possibly older, yet the measurement cannot be pushed to a fine enough edge to crown one and dismiss the other. So the scientists who study these plants do something that is quietly admirable. They decline to pretend. They lay both fossils side by side and say plainly that the precision we have at 125 to 130 million years does not allow a confident single first flower title. There is no ribbon-cutting moment in the record. There is no single morning when the world's first blossom opened. There is only a scatter of early, humble, water-bound plants, all learning the same trick at roughly the same time, in places far apart. That refusal to overclaim is worth sitting with as you drift. We badly want a first. We want a name, a date, a single seed we can point to and call the beginning. The deep past rarely offers that. It offers instead a slow blur of near-simultaneous beginnings, and a reminder that the truest answer is sometimes we cannot yet say. There is no shame in that sentence. There is only patience. If these calm walks through deep time are the kind of thing you want more of, you can keep them close by choosing to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then you can simply let your eyes fall shut and let the Cretaceous lakes keep swaying on their own. Here is the part that surprises almost everyone. Once these first flowers appeared, the world did not rush to greet them. Blossoms did not spread across the land in a single season. For a long stretch of the early Cretaceous, flowering plants stayed rare and small and marginal, clinging to the wet edges of things, to lake shores and stream banks and disturbed ground. The great forests were still the old forests. The horizon was still ruled by conifers and cycads and ferns, the same green machinery that had fed dinosaurs for tens of millions of years. And you do not have to imagine that lingering flowerless world. You can look directly inside a single animal that lived in it and see exactly what it ate. Travel now to the far northwest of the same span of time, to what is now Alberta, in Canada, roughly 110 million years ago. The landscape here is coastal and lush and warm. Ferns carpet the ground in low green sweeps. Conifers stand in dark ranks. Cycads hold their stiff crowns above the undergrowth, and fan-leaved ginkgos catch the light in a shape you could still recognize today. Somewhere in this country moves a heavily armoured plant-eater, low and broad and slow, its back plated in bony armour and lined with defensive spikes. This is Borealopelta markmitchelli, a nodosaur, one of the armoured dinosaurs, and it is not famous mainly for how it lived. It is famous for how completely it was preserved. When its body finally came to rest, it was buried so quickly and so perfectly that its skin, its armour, even the shape of the scales survived in stone. It is less a skeleton than a statue cast by the earth itself, a dinosaur caught almost mid-breath, and inside that astonishing fossil, sealed within the belly, was a preserved mass of its final meal, not a guess, not a reconstruction, the actual chewed contents of a dinosaur's gut, held in the rock for around 110 million years, waiting to be read. When researchers studied that stomach mass, the answer was strikingly clear. About 88% of the meal was chewed fern leaf. Not conifer, not cycad, not flower. Fern. Another small share, roughly 7%, was stems and twigs, the tougher woody bits swallowed alongside the soft fronds. This was a leaf-eater's meal, cropped low and close to the ground, from the most old-fashioned green on the landscape. There was more folded into that last supper. Mixed through the plant matter were gastroliths, smooth stones the animal had deliberately swallowed to help grind its food in a muscular gut, the way some living birds swallow grit today. And there was charcoal, small blackened fragments of burned plant tissue threaded all through the mass. That charcoal tells a small, vivid story of the animal's final days. Fire had swept this landscape not long before, and ferns are famous for how quickly they flush back after a burn, sending up fresh tender fronds through blackened ground while slower plants are still recovering. This nodosaur had almost certainly been feeding on that fast green regrowth, cropping soft new ferns from a recently scorched clearing, swallowing flecks of charcoal along with every mouthful. So picture the scene the fossil preserves: a wide clearing still smelling faintly of old smoke, the ground blackened and bristling with bright new fern shoots cool and soft against the char, a massive armoured animal working slowly across it, head low, jaws grinding, gizzard stones turning in its belly. And in that entire meadow, in that entire meal, not one flower. Around 110 million years ago, a full 20 million years after the first flowering plants had already appeared somewhere on Earth, a Cretaceous herbivore ate a completely flowerless supper and lay down in a flowerless world. That is the thing worth holding on to tonight. Flowers existed. Flowers had existed for millions of years already. And still, for a large herbivore in a rich green landscape, they simply did not matter yet. They were a rumour at the edges, not the substance of the world. The old flora still set the table. The old flora still fed the giants. But the balance was quietly tipping. Slowly at first, so slowly that no single generation of animals could have noticed, the flowering plants were gaining ground. They began as weeds of the margins and the disturbed places, plants that grew fast, reproduced fast, and colonized the raw open patches that fire and flood kept making. And that fast, opportunistic habit turned out to be a kind of superpower in a restless world. Then, in the middle of the Cretaceous, something shifted from slow to swift. Flowering plants stopped being marginal and began, over a stretch of a few million years, to diversify with astonishing speed. New forms, new leaf shapes, new ways of reproducing spilling outward across the land. The Green Revolution had a long, quiet fuse, and then it caught. This is the slow then sudden pattern that runs through the whole tale, a change that idles for ages and then, when conditions finally align, moves almost too fast to follow in the rock, This burst was strange enough and abrupt enough that it troubled one of the sharpest minds ever to look at the living world. Charles Darwin, who was so comfortable with slow, gradual change, found the sudden explosion of flowering plants genuinely unsettling. He called it an abominable mystery. How could this one group of plants appear and then diversify so rapidly, so completely, seemingly out of step with the patient tempo he saw everywhere else in nature? That mystery is still argued over today, and it deserves a fuller telling than a quiet night like this should carry. The role of insects, the timing of pollination, the awkward gaps in the fossil record, all of it is genuinely unresolved, and we will set it gently aside here for its own proper hour. For now it is enough to know that the puzzle is real, that it has a name, and that even Darwin looked at these flowers and admitted he could not fully explain them. What we can say is simpler and stranger and easier to feel as you lie still. For most of the time flowers have existed, they were not the point. They spent their first long age as a quiet undercurrent beneath an older, greener order, waiting, spreading, patient, while ferns and conifers and cycad still ran the visible world. And then colour came, not all at once, not as a single dawn, but gradually, the way warmth moves up a cold arm when you finally step inside from the frost. First the fingertips, then the wrist, then slowly the whole limb waking to it. That is how colour arrived on land. A blush here, a bright tuft there, a scatter of new hues along a stream bank, then across a hillside, then, over ages, spreading into a world that had known only green and brown and the grey of bare stone for hundreds of millions of years. It is worth pausing on how total that older palette had been. From the first green stubble on naked Silurian rock, through the coal forests, through the conifer world the dinosaurs browsed, the land had offered essentially one register of colour. Green in every shade the eye could hold, brown in bark and mud and dead frond, grey in stone and ash and rain. No petals, no red, no violet, no gold thrown up to the sun. A green world, complete and self-contained, that had never once needed a flower. The first flowers barely broke that pattern. Montsechia flowered underwater, invisible from the surface. Archaeopteris was a plain green weed with its machinery hidden inside. Even as flowering plants grew common, most of the earliest ones were small, modest, easy to overlook, more likely to be mistaken for pondweed than admired as blossoms. The riot of colour you picture when you hear the word flower was still far in the future, still waiting to be built petal by petal across the later Cretaceous and beyond. And almost nothing alive understood what was beginning. The nodosaur cropping its ferns did not know. The sauropods stripping conifer branches did not know. The insects droning through the warm air did not know they stood at the edge of a partnership that would, in time, reshape both flowers and pollinators together. There was no witness who grasped the moment, because in truth there was no moment, only a long, slow accumulation that would not fully change everything until ages after the first seed was ever folded into the first small fruit. That is the quiet grandeur of it. The most transformative thing to happen to the green world in 300 million years did not arrive with any drama at all. It arrived as a weed in a lake. It arrived as a fruit smaller than a fingernail. It arrived so softly that the giant animals living right beside it went on eating exactly as their ancestors had, for millions of years more, never once tasting the difference. So let the scene widen now, and let it slow. Pull back from the single armoured animal in its burned clearing, from the single weed swaying in its Spanish lake, from the single ash-buried stem in its Chinese rock. Let all of them settle back into the enormous green quiet they came from. The conifers still stand dark on the ridgelines. The cycads still hold their stiff crowns. The ferns still carpet the wet ground, soft and old and unbothered, as they had since long before any flower drew breath. And threaded invisibly through all of it, Patient and unhurried, the new plants keep folding their seeds into their fruit. No fanfare, no signal. Just a small enclosed chamber doing its quiet work by the water's edge, in a world too busy being green to notice it had already begun to change. You can rest inside that stillness now, in the last long age when the flowerless world was still mostly intact, when colour was only just beginning to move across the land like warmth into a cold limb, one faint bloom at a time. Picture a single flower pressed flat in stone, no wider than your thumbnail, lying in grey rock from central Spain. It has no petals, it carries no scent, no bright rim of colour to catch a passing eye. This is Montsechia, and it grew underwater around 130 million years ago, in the still ponds of what is now the Iberian Range. You could have waded straight past it and never known. Yet inside it sat the one trait that defines a flowering plant, a small fruit-like case holding a single seed. You are looking at one of the oldest flowers anyone has ever found, and already, standing here in the shallows in your mind, you can feel the difficulty. Nothing about this plant announces itself. Nothing about it looks like the beginning of a revolution. That difficulty has a name, and it belongs to Charles Darwin. Late in his life, he wrote about the sudden appearance and rapid spread of flowering plants in the middle of the Cretaceous, and he called it an abominable mystery. It troubled him because it did not fit the slow, patient pace his theory expected. Flowers seemed to arrive almost all at once, spreading and splitting into countless forms across the land in what looked, against the vast backdrop of deep time, like a single quick breath. Where was the long, gradual build-up? Where were the awkward in-between steps? More than a century and a half later, you should know something plainly. That mystery is not solved. It is still argued over, still worked at, still open. Scientists have narrowed it and sharpened it and added enormous detail to it. But the core of Darwin's unease has never fully gone away. Let yourself sit inside the leading idea first, because it is a beautiful one. The most popular explanation for the explosion of flowers is the arrival of the insects that visit them. Think of a bee moving from bloom to bloom, a beetle crawling into a cup of pollen, a fly drawn in by colour and scent. In this picture, flowers and their pollinators built each other. A plant that could lure an insect could send its pollen straight to another flower of its kind, precise and targeted, instead of casting it to the wind and hoping. In return, the insect got food. Over time, so the story goes, each pushed the other to become more varied, more specialized, more inventive. Flowers grew brighter and sweeter. Insects grew tools to reach them. The two danced upward together, and the world filled with color. It is a satisfying idea. You can almost hear it working. And there is real truth in it, because pollination by animals genuinely does let flowering plants split into new forms faster than wind-pollinated plants can. But the fossil record, when you lay it out carefully, does not tell such a tidy tale. The dates refuse to line up the way the neat version needs them to. Here is the awkward part, and it is worth slowing down for. If flowers and their pollinating insects rose together in lockstep, you would expect them to bloom and buzz in the same stretch of time. Instead, the richness of insect families appears to have peaked around 125 million years ago, at a moment when flowering plants were still rare, still minor, still a small green footnote in a world ruled by conifers and cycads and ferns. The insects were already diverse. The flowers had barely begun. Then there is the other end of the puzzle. Clear fossil evidence of insects actually feeding on the pollen of flowering plants does not show up until much later, around 99 million years ago. That is tens of millions of years after the first flowers appear in the rock. So the direct proof of the partnership, the bug caught in the act with flower pollen on its body, arrives long after flowers had already started to spread and diversify. Feel the shape of that problem. The insects seem to have been ready too early. The evidence of the partnership seems to arrive too late, and the flowers, in between, appear to have begun their rise without the clean simultaneous companionship the simple story asks for. This does not mean insects had nothing to do with it. It means the picture is messier than a single elegant duet. Perhaps insects that had fed on other plants, on the pollen of conifers and their kin, simply drifted over to flowers when flowers offered something better. Perhaps the coevolution came in stages, and in bursts rather than in one smooth climb. These are the kinds of questions researchers are still turning over, and no one gets to close them yet. This is a good place to pause and stay with you a moment. If you are drifting, let the questions themselves be the thing you rest on. There is no answer you're missing, no fact you need to hold on to. Whole careers are spent inside this single uncertainty, and the uncertainty is comfortable in its way. It asks nothing of you but attention. And if you find these slow walks through deep time worth returning to, you can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Now come back to that flat little flower in the Spanish stone, because the mystery goes deeper than timing. It reaches down into a question that sounds almost simple. Which flower came first? You met Montsechia already, the aquatic plant from roughly 130 million years ago, with no petals and no nectar, just those seed-bearing cases hidden in its underwater stems, set beside it another famous contender from the other side of the world. In the fossil beds of the Yixian Formation in China lies Archaeopteris, dated to around 125 million years ago. It too lacked petals. It too lacked the outer leaves called sepals that wrap a modern bud. But it carried the reproductive parts that mark a true flowering plant, the carpels that hold the seeds and the stamens that make the pollen. For years, Archaeopteris wore the crown in many tellings, the oldest flower, the first bloom. Then Montsechia was studied again, more closely, and the crown slipped. The reanalysis argued that Montsechia was at least as old as Archaeopteris, and possibly older. And here is where you meet the honest limit of the science. At these depths of time, 125 million years, 130 million years, the tools for dating rock cannot slice thin enough to separate the two with confidence. The error bars overlap. The margins blur. You cannot stand at this distance and declare a single winner without pretending to a precision no one actually has. So the truthful thing to say is this: there is no confirmed first flower. There is a small cluster of very early ones scattered across continents, none of them looking much like a rose or a lily, all of them arriving in a window too tight for the rock to resolve. Montsechia and Archaeopteris are not rivals with a clear verdict waiting. They are two neighbours in a doorway, and you cannot quite tell which one crossed the threshold first. Hold all of this in your mind at once, gently, the way you might hold something fragile in an open hand. Darwin's mystery is like a puzzle laid out on your palm with the corner pieces missing. You can see much of the middle. You can trace the shapes of insects growing diverse, of flowers beginning to spread, of the great mid-Cretaceous burst of new plant forms. But the corners, the exact starting points, the precise order, the clean cause, those pieces are simply not in your hand. They may still be in the ground somewhere, waiting in unopened rock, or they may be lost for good, ground away by time before anyone could find them. That is not a failure. It is the honest edge of what the fossils can tell you. And it is worth noticing how strange it is that this particular mystery, the origin of the flowers that now feed nearly everything, remains one of the most stubbornly open questions in all of natural history. You live in a world painted by these plants. Almost every fruit you have tasted, every field of grain, every blossom traces back to that shadowy window in the Cretaceous, and the beginning of it stays half hidden. Think of what was and was not watching it happen. No creature alive at the time understood what was starting. The insects that fed among the first flowers were not aware of building anything. The great dinosaurs browsing the conifers nearby did not register the small aquatic plants tucked into the ponds. The revolution had no witnesses who could have named it. It unfolded across tens of millions of years, quietly, in scattered wetlands and floodplains, without ceremony and without alarm. And that is the last thing to carry with you as the argument settles back into silence. The rise of the flowers was not a single sunrise. It was not one bloom opening on one morning while the world turned to look. It was slow and patchy and uncertain even now to the people who study it hardest. The competing ideas, the mismatched dates, the two nameless flowers in their overlapping doorway, all of it points to the same calm conclusion. Something enormous began without anyone or anything knowing it had begun. The flowerless world did not end in a moment. It simply and slowly filled with colour while almost nothing alive was watching. The flowerless world did not end in a moment. It simply and slowly filled with colour while almost nothing alive was watching. The flowerless world did not end in a moment. It simply and slowly filled with colour while almost nothing alive was watching. No trumpet marked it. No creature paused over the first petal, because for the whole long green age before it there had been no petal to miss. So let your eye drift up now, slow and easy, until the whole of it lies below you like a valley seen from a high ridge at dusk. Start where it started. Bare rock, Ordovician and Silurian stone, grey and wind-scoured, water sliding over it with no leaf anywhere to slow the current. The horizon runs flat in every direction, open and starkly lit, because nothing on the planet stands tall enough to throw a shade. You could have walked 1,000 miles across that early land and never once passed beneath a living thing. Then the first green stubble. Cooksonia, only a few inches high, leafless stems no thicker than thread, tipped with small capsules of spores. Around 425 million years ago, in what is now Wales, that was the tallest thing life had managed on land. Lift away a little, and it dissolves into the rock like a faint bloom of frost, easy to miss, impossible to undo. Rise higher, and the green begins to climb. In the Devonian, the first true forests thicken the ground. Near a Scottish hot spring called Rhynie, plants under 16 inches tall are entombed cell by cell in silica, spiders and mites among them, an entire small wetland held perfectly still. Then Archaeopteris, one of the earliest real trees, spreading fern-like crowns over a woody trunk, sending roots more than 30 feet down through the soil. The land learns to hold water, to build shade, to make a little of its own weather, keep drifting back. The Carboniferous swamps flood into view, layered and dark. Scale trees like Lepidodendron rise as much as 160 feet, their bark stamped with diamond-shaped scars, holding themselves up not with true wood but with a thick watertight rind. Beneath them, tree ferns like Soronius spread fronds 30 to 50 feet overhead, cloaking the floor in deep, humid shade. The whole basin smells of standing water and slow rot, of fallen trunks too drowned in airless mud to decay, which is the very reason so much of it will one day become coal. The air is thick, as much as 35% oxygen, rich enough to let a fire race hot, rich enough to let the insects grow strange and large. A dragonfly relative Meganeura crosses the gloom on wings wide as a hawk. An armoured millipede Arthropleura, 8 feet long, scrapes through the leaf litter, and no bird call anywhere answers it, because there are as yet no birds to call. Higher still, and the swamps drain and dry. The green does not leave, it only changes its coat. Now come the seed plants, the gymnosperms, carrying their offspring in cupules and cones instead of trusting them to standing water. Across the Triassic floodplains that became the painted stone of Arizona, tall conifers like Archaeopteris stand among slow rivers and quiet lakes, resin-scented, over 200 kinds of plant sharing that one ancient ground. Pull back once more, and the giants arrive to eat it. The Jurassic and the Early Cretaceous roll out forests of cycads with stiff palm-like crowns, of tall conifers, of fan-leaved ginkgos whose leaf has barely changed its shape in 170 million years. You could hold one of those fans in your hand today, and a sauropod would recognize it. Long-necked sauropods and plated stegosaurs move through the stands, cropping green because there is only ever green to crop. No flower colours the understory. No fruit hangs from any branch. An armoured nodosaur named Borealopelta lies down for the last time, with a belly full of chewed fern and smooth-swallowed stones, the nearest thing we will ever have to standing in that flowerless meadow ourselves. And then, quietly, the colour. Down among the water and the edges, small plants begin to fold their seeds inside true fruit. Montsechia, drifting underwater in what is now Spain, with no petal and no scent, an Archaeopteris in the lake beds of China, carrying the first carpels and stamens. Around 130 million years ago, the rule that had held for the entire Green Age begins, very softly, to break. Not with a bloom you would have noticed, just a difference, spreading at the margins. That is the shape of it. Roughly 300 million years of a fully green planet that never once knew a flower. Green and brown and the grey of bare stone and nothing more, for a stretch of time so long the mind cannot hold it whole. It is going to slip through your fingers if you try to grasp it, so do not try. Let it stay a shape instead of a number, because held from up here, all of it thins to almost nothing. 300 million years, the bare rock and the first stubble, the Devonian woods and the coal giants, the conifer floodplains and the dinosaur pastures and the first small underwater flowers, all of it narrowing until it is no wider than a single held breath, in and out. That is the whole flowerless world, passing across you in one slow tide of air. Feel it settle now. There is no more ground to cover, no next fact waiting past the edge of the dark. In one blink of geological instant the whole Green Age rose and fell, and you have walked its full length tonight, from bare stone to the first quiet petal, and now you can lay it down. Let the green recede. Let it pull back the way a tide pulls back off your ankles, warm and unhurried, drawing the colour and the shade and the enormous slow forests out towards some far horizon you no longer need to reach. The scale trees soften, the conifers dim, the ferns and cycads and ginkgos blur into one long green haze, and then even the haze begins to fade away into the dark behind your eyes. You do not have to hold any of it. The names can rest. The numbers can rest. The 300 million years can go on turning without you watching exactly as they always did. Patient and green and untroubled by whether anything noticed. Nothing living ever needed an audience to become what it became. It only needed time, and time was the one thing there was always enough of. So take one last slow deep breath of that ancient, oxygen-thick air and let the green go quiet. The forest that had no flowers stands behind you now, vast and dim and finished, and it asks nothing of you at all but sleep. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.